We assume the Mongol army won through sheer, overwhelming numbers, but at nearly every major engagement, from the Kalka River in 1223 to the Sajau in 1241, the Mongols were outnumbered, winning instead through battlefield deception, decimal system coordination, and psychological warfare so precise it bordered on science. That assumption, the one you probably carried into this video without even realizing it, is exactly what the Mongols wanted you to believe. Not you specifically. Everyone. Every king, every general, every city magistrate who ever looked out from his walls and tried to calculate his odds against the approaching storm. The terror of the Mongol conquests was not just that they came, it was that nobody understood how they won, and in that confusion, in that gap between what people thought they were facing and what they were actually facing, entire civilizations collapsed. Let's start with the word itself, horde. It conjures something primal and uncontrollable. A vast, seething mass of humanity pouring across the steppe like a flood that cannot be reasoned with, only endured. The word actually comes from the Turkic and Mongol word ordu, meaning camp or headquarters. It was a bureaucratic term, an administrative term. The Mongols would have found your mental image of a mindless flood deeply amusing, because the reality was almost the exact opposite of mindless. At its absolute largest, the Mongol military fielded somewhere around 150,000 soldiers. That number represents the peak of their operational capacity, the maximum number of horses, riders, and supply lines they could coordinate across a single campaign theatre. Many of the armies they deployed were considerably smaller. The force that crossed into Europe in 1241 was somewhere between 80,000 and 150,000, depending on which historical estimate you trust. The force that devastated the Rus-Kuman alliance at the Kalka River in 1223 was approximately 20,000 men. 20,000! Against an estimated 80,000 defenders. That is not a horde overwhelming its enemies by weight of numbers. That is something else entirely. So, what was it exactly? Begin with structure. The Mongol army was organised on a decimal system so elegant in its simplicity and so devastating in its application that it functioned less like a medieval army and more like a nervous system. At the base level, 10 men formed an arban, a unit small enough that every soldier knew every other soldier by name, by habit, by the sound of their breathing on a night march. 10 arbans formed a zun of 100, 10 zuns formed a mingan of 1,000, 10 mingans formed a tumen, 10,000 soldiers operating as a single coordinated mass. Every level of the hierarchy was accountable to the level above it. Every commander knew exactly how many men he had at any given moment, because the decimal structure made gaps immediately visible. If an arban showed up with 8 men instead of 10, that absence registered instantly and moved up the chain of command. No European army of the 13th century could do this. Feudal levies were assembled from obligations and personal loyalty, not from standing organisational charts. A European king calling his vassals to war was, in practical terms, managing a coalition of private armies, each with different equipment, different training, and different levels of commitment to the enterprise. At the Battle of Legnica in April 1241, the combined Polish and German force included Teutonic Knights, Templar Knights, Polish cavalry, Silesian infantry, and Moravian levies, men who spoke different languages, followed different commanders, and had never drilled together in their lives. They were brave. They were formidable individually. They were, against the Mongol decimal machine, outclassed before the first arrow flew. The two-man structure meant that Mongol commanders could execute maneuvers of extraordinary complexity, because every unit in the chain understood its role and could execute it without waiting for new orders. What looked from the outside like chaotic, fluid movement across a battlefield was actually the product of pre-planned contingency responses, drilled into every rider from the time he could stay on a horse. This was not inspiration. This was repetition. This was training so thorough it had become instinct. And then there was the intelligence apparatus, which may be the most underappreciated component of Mongol military dominance. Weeks, sometimes months, before the main Mongol force arrived in a new region, scouts were already there. Not just a handful of outriders checking the road. Dedicated reconnaissance units moved through target territories in civilian disguise, counting garrison sizes, mapping river crossings, identifying which cities stored grain, which roads became impassable in spring mud, which local lords had conflicts with their neighbours that could be exploited. This intelligence moved back along the Yam relay system, a network of mounted couriers stationed at fixed intervals across the empire, and was integrated into operational planning before any army moved. When the Mongols arrived outside a city, they frequently knew more about that city's defences than the city's own governor. They knew the depth of the wells, the thickness of the walls, the size of the garrison, the state of the food stores. They had already identified the weakest gate, they had already mapped the escape routes, and they had already positioned forces to cover those escape routes before the battle even began. This was not luck. This was intelligence-driven warfare, and it predated the formal development of military intelligence doctrine in the West by several centuries. Now, consider what happened at the Kalka River on May 31st, 1223. The Rus princes and their Cuman allies had been tracking a Mongol raiding force, about 20,000 cavalry under the generals Jebe and Subutai, across the steppe for days. The Russians believed they were pursuing a retreating enemy. The Mongols had been giving ground deliberately, drawing the combined force eastward, stretching their supply lines, letting exhaustion and overconfidence do their quiet work. When the Rus-Kuman army reached the Kalka River, roughly 80,000 strong and convinced they had their quarry cornered, the Mongols turned around. What followed lasted almost no time at all. The feigned retreat snapped into a coordinated encirclement. Mongol horse archers, riders who could fire with accuracy at full gallop, who could turn in the saddle and shoot behind them with lethal precision, began working the flanks of an enemy that had been advancing in pursuit formation rather than battle formation. The Cumans, fighting independently from the Russian infantry, broke under the initial assault and fled, collapsing the left flank. The Russian forces, caught unprepared for a genuine engagement, were driven into the river. 8 of the 10 participating Rus princes died in the battle or its immediate aftermath. The captured princes were not beheaded or burned or subjected to any of the cruelties a medieval European army might have preferred. The Mongols wrapped them in cloth, laid boards over them, and held a victory feast on top of them, crushing them slowly under the weight of celebrating soldiers. The method was deliberate. It communicated something specific. Not just that you lost, but that your death itself was incorporated into our celebration. That there is no version of this where you matter. 73 days later, the Mongol force had simply vanished back into the steppe. They were not ready to hold Russian territory yet. This had been reconnaissance, a test, a message. And the survivors who dragged themselves back to their cities carried that message with them in every traumatized sentence they spoke. This was the psychological warfare machine operating exactly as designed. The Mongols had a policy toward conquered populations that was, in its cold logic, almost administrative in its clarity. Your cities that received Mongol envoys and surrendered without resistance were generally spared, their population put to work, their skilled craftsmen and engineers absorbed into the Mongol war effort, their trade networks left functioning because functional trade networks paid taxes. This was not mercy. This was economics. Cities that refused, that killed the envoys, that chose to fight. Those cities were destroyed so completely and so theatrically that the destruction itself became a communication broadcast across hundreds of miles. And when those cities fell, the Mongols did something specific with the survivors. They did not simply leave them behind. They sent them forward, deliberately, ahead of the next advance. Traumatized, starving refugees streaming toward the next city, the next kingdom. The next king who was currently trying to calculate whether he could hold his walls. And those refugees arrived carrying stories that were, if anything, more terrifying than the reality, because human imagination always fills in the gaps of horror with something worse than the truth. Think about what that means operationally. The Mongols were using human beings as weapons of mass psychological disruption weeks before their army ever came into view. The fear arrived first. It softened the target. And when the actual army finally appeared on the horizon, cities that might have fought were already calculating surrender, because the cost of resistance had been communicated in the faces of everyone who had tried it. The composite bow accelerates this picture further. Mongol cavalry archers operated recurved composite bows, constructed from layers of horn, wood and sinew, with a draw weight of around 160 pounds and an effective combat range of more than 200 yards. A trained Mongol archer could fire between 6 and 12 arrows per minute from horseback at full gallop. An entire tumen of 10,000 riders, operating in rotating waves so that some were always advancing, while others fell back to reload, could sustain a rate of fire that no infantry formation of the period could withstand in open terrain. And the Mongols almost always engineered open terrain, by choosing where and when to engage, by using the feigned retreat to pull enemies out of defensive positions, by attacking in winter when frozen rivers became highways, and forests became less effective cover. Legnica, on April 9th, 1241, took roughly 4 hours. The Polish-German force under Duke Henry II of Silesia was drawn out of its defensive position by, and this requires a moment of appreciation for its audacity, a smokescreen. Mongol forces set fire to materials that produced thick, choking clouds of smoke, obscuring the battlefield at the critical moment when the European cavalry thought they were pressing an advantage. Henry's forces charged into confusion. When the smoke cleared, metaphorically and literally, the battle was already decided. Henry was killed. His head was paraded on a pike around the walls of the nearby castle, where his wife had taken refuge. On the same day, less than 300 miles to the southeast, Subutai was destroying the Hungarian royal army at the Sajo River, in a battle that had been planned with such methodical precision that Mongol engineers had secretly constructed bridges and emplaced artillery positions in the dark before dawn, without the Hungarian army, camped within earshot, realizing what was happening. 2 separate armies, 2 separate battlefields, 2 complete victories, same day. That is coordination. That is what the decimal system and the YAM intelligence network and years of operational planning made possible. Not a horde, a machine. And here is the thing that should genuinely unsettle you, the thing that separates this from ordinary military history. Every component of Mongol warfare was designed not just to defeat the enemy in front of them, but to make future enemies easier to defeat. The intelligence network reduced the cost of the next campaign. The psychological operations reduced resistance at the next city. The deliberate absorption of conquered engineers, physicians, astronomers and administrators made the army that arrived at the next frontier more capable than the one that had fought the battle before. They were iterating. In a 13th century world where most armies were rebuilt from scratch for each campaign, the Mongols were running something closer to a continuously learning organization. The real weapon was never the cavalry. It was never the numbers, because the numbers were actually against them, almost everywhere, almost always. The real weapon was information, flowing back through relay riders at speeds no enemy could match. He is being processed by commanders who had been trained since childhood, in a culture where warfare was the primary intellectual discipline, and translated into action by an army that could execute complex multi-unit maneuvers as smoothly as a single rider turning his horse. Fear was just the delivery mechanism. The product being delivered was paralysis, and paralysis in war is the same as defeat. By the time most of their enemies understood what they were actually facing, the gates were already open. So now you understand the machine. You understand the decimal architecture, the intelligence networks bleeding information across hundreds of miles, the psychological operations that weaponized human terror into a logistical asset. You understand that the Mongol army was a continuously learning organism, not a flood, but a scalpel. Precise. He's cold, and always improving. But machines do not build themselves. Someone had to design it. Someone had to survive long enough, and hurt badly enough, and want something desperately enough that they were willing to spend an entire lifetime hammering a fractured, starving, clan-warring people into the most effective fighting force the world had ever seen. And to understand how the machine was built, you have to go back to the very beginning. Not to a palace, not to a court, not to any of the places where great rulers of the 13th century were raised in comfort and groomed for power. You have to go to the steppe, specifically to a bend in the Onon River, in what is now northeastern Mongolia, close to the shores of Lake Baikal in the year 1162. The child came into the world with his right fist clenched. The midwives pried open his fingers and found a clot of dark blood inside, the size of a knuckle. On the Mongolian steppe, where every unusual event was filtered through a dense web of omen and spiritual reading, this was not an accident. Blood in the fist of a newborn boy meant something. It meant the child had arrived already holding something, already claiming something. His father, a minor clan leader named Yasugei, named the boy Temujin, after a Tatar chieftain he had just captured and defeated in battle. The name was taken as a trophy, draped over a newborn son like a flag planted in conquered ground. Even the naming was an act of violence sublimated into symbolism. Temujin was born into a world that required something close to constant vigilance simply to survive. Then the Mongolian steppe in the 12th century was not a unified nation. It was a landscape of competing tribes, Mongols, Tatars, Merkits, Naimans, Kerets, locked in cycles of raid, revenge, and shifting alliance that had been running for generations without resolution. Loyalty on the steppe was expressed through kinship and through the personal charisma of individual leaders, and it evaporated with startling speed when those leaders showed weakness or died. The geopolitics of the steppe were, at their foundation, mercilessly personal, which means that when the person at the centre of your family's protection disappeared, the consequences were immediate and physical. Temujin was 9 years old when he lost his father, while Yasugei had ridden north to negotiate a marriage arrangement for his son. Temujin was to be betrothed to a girl named Berta from the Ongirat clan, a match that would extend the family's alliance network. The journey went well. Yasugei left his son with Berta's family as custom dictated, to spend time learning the ways of his future wife's people. On the ride home, Yasugei stopped at a Tatar encampment. This was standard steppe hospitality, the obligation to share food with travellers. The Tatars recognised him. They had grievances with his clan, and they poisoned the food. Yasugei died 3 days later, close enough to home to send for his eldest son, but not close enough for Temujin to arrive before it was over. What happened next reveals more about the steppe world than almost any other single event. The Yasugei's clan, the people his father had led, the people who had known Temujin his entire life, looked at the widow and her children and made a calculation. Without Yasugei, there was nothing binding them to this family. No political advantage, no military protection, no wealth. Holun, Temujin's mother, was a capable and formidable woman by every account that survives. But capability without power on the steppe was irrelevant. The clan took their animals and their belongings and rode away. They left Holun with her children and almost nothing else. No horses to hunt with, no dried meat to last the winter, no protection from rival clans who now looked at this abandoned widow and saw something to be taken from rather than traded with. A 9-year-old boy, his mother, his younger brothers, and a steppe winter. Understand what the Mongolian steppe does to a family without resources. There is no neighbouring farmhouse to appeal to. There is no village elder who will intervene out of civic obligation. The steppe in winter is, for a family without horses and without stored food, a death sentence being served slowly. Holun dug up roots. She fished in streams. She kept her children alive through methods that the secret history of the Mongols, the oldest surviving account of this period, describes with a frankness that makes it almost unbearable to read. The children competed with birds for berries. They survived seasons that should have killed them, and Temujin, the oldest son, was the one responsible for helping make survival possible. He was 9. He would be responsible for his family's survival for the next several years. He would be 9. And then 10, and then 11, carrying a weight that most grown men never have to carry, in conditions that most grown men could not endure. 4 years later, when he was 13, something happened that tells you exactly what those years had done to him. There were half-brothers in the household, sons of Yasuge by another wife, children who were part of the extended family that Hulun was now keeping alive. The older of these half-brothers was named Begta. On the steppe, food was not metaphorically important. It was the primary currency of survival, the only thing standing between a family and extinction. When Begta stole a fish that Temujin and his brother Kasar had caught, or when he claimed a lark they had killed, the sources give slightly varying details. He was not committing a trivial act of sibling rivalry. He was reducing the family's margin against death. Temujin did not argue with him. He did not go to his mother. He tracked Begta down with his brother Khazar. Begta, to his credit, seems to have understood what was coming. The secret history records that he sat down and accepted his fate with something close to dignity, asking only that his full brother Belgute be spared. Temujin and Kasar shot him with arrows, 2 boys, approaching from separate directions, ensuring there was no escape. Methodical, deliberate, coordinated. It was not rage. That is the crucial point. A rageful killing would have been chaotic, impulsive, loud. This was organized. This was a 13-year-old boy who had been living in survival conditions for 4 years, making a cold, strategic decision that a competitor within his household needed to be eliminated, and then executing that decision without hesitation. The same instinct that would eventually design an empire's military doctrine was already operating inside a starving adolescent on the Mongolian steppe. Hulun was furious when she found out. The secret history records her grief and anger in detail. But the deed was done. Temujin did not appear to waver. The boy who had been abandoned was starting to learn a specific lesson, that waiting for external authority to protect you was a form of suicide. That survival required the willingness to act first and to act completely. This lesson was about to be reinforced by catastrophe. At some point in his mid-teens, the exact timing is uncertain, because the secret history compresses and dramatizes events in ways that make precise chronology difficult. Temujin was captured by the Taichud tribe. This was one of the clans that had abandoned his family after Yasuge's death. Now they held the son as a slave. The instrument of his captivity was a kang, a heavy wooden frame fitted around the neck and wrists, essentially a portable prison that immobilized its wearer's arms and made independent movement agonizing. Slaves in kangs required guards to prevent them from falling and suffocating in their sleep. They were humiliated by design, the physical restriction communicating absolute social dominance in a culture where physical freedom and mobility were fundamental to identity. For a boy who had already survived abandonment, his father's murder, and years of near starvation, the Kangwei was one humiliation too far. He had not survived 4 years on the steppe to spend his life in a wooden collar. During a celebration, a festival when guards were distracted and the attention of the camp was elsewhere, Temujin moved. The details in the source material are vivid enough to feel almost cinematic. He used the Kangwei itself as a weapon, swinging the heavy wooden frame into his guard. Then he ran for the river, the Onon River, close to where he had been born, close to where he would one day be proclaimed ruler of the world. He lowered himself into the water, lying flat, submerging everything except his nose and his eyes. The surface of the water closed over him. The Taichiud searched the riverbanks. Searchers on horseback moved through the reeds, close enough that Temujin could hear horses breathing. close enough that a man's gaze moving a few degrees in any direction would have ended everything. They did not find him. A man named Sorkun Shira, who had noticed Temujin during his captivity and had apparently made some private moral calculation about which side of history he wanted to stand on, helped conceal him, gave him a felt mat to hide beneath in a cart, eventually helped him escape the camp's perimeter entirely. Temujin was free. He had escaped a situation that should have been inescapable, using his own physical captivity as the instrument of his liberation. This is not metaphorical. He used the kangye, the thing that was meant to break him, to break the man who held him. The pattern is almost too perfect to be real, except that it keeps recurring. Every instrument of his subjugation becomes a tool he turns back on those who applied it. The next major wound arrived through the person he loved most. Berta, the girl his father had chosen for him before his death. The one he had been left with during that last journey of Yesugei's, the woman he'd returned to and married as soon as he had enough alliance and standing to claim her, was kidnapped by the Merkits. The Merkits had their own grievance against Temujin's family. Yesugei had kidnapped Hoylan from a Merkit man before Temujin was born. Steppe logic being what it was, the answer to one kidnapping was another kidnapping, and Berta was the target. Temujin did not have an army. He did not have a clan. He had connections carefully cultivated since his escape from the Taichiud, a blood brother named Jamuga, and crucially a relationship with a powerful Kerait leader named Togrul, whom Yesugei had called a sworn friend. This is where you see, for the first time in clear operational form, the diplomatic skill that would eventually unite an entire people. Temujin leveraged Togrul's sense of obligation, leveraged his bond with Jamuga, assembled a force larger than anything he could have raised on his own, and went after the Merkits with the kind of focused, personal fury that only a man rescuing someone irreplaceable can generate. They destroyed the Merkit camp. Berta was recovered. But she returned pregnant, and the child's paternity was unknowable. She had been held long enough that no honest calculation could guarantee the timing. On the steppe, where lineage was everything, where the question of who a man's sons actually were had profound political and social weight, this should have been a crisis that destroyed them both. Temujin publicly acknowledged the child as his own. The boy was named Yolchi. The name means guest, an acknowledgement embedded in the name itself of the ambiguity, held openly and without apparent shame. He is of my seed, Temujin reportedly said, and whatever he believed privately, publicly that statement closed the question. This is not sentiment. Every decision Temujin made in these years had a structural logic. Abandoning Yolchi would have been a fracture in his household, at a moment when he could afford no fractures. Accepting the child publicly was a display of authority, the declaration that his will, not biological probability, would define the reality of his family. Other people's opinions of the paternity were irrelevant. He said the boy was his son. The boy was his son. Reality was what he declared it to be, and anyone who disagreed was implicitly challenging a man who had already demonstrated his willingness to act on challenges with complete finality. Count the lessons he'd learned by his mid-20s. His clan abandoned him. He learned that loyalty had to be built, not inherited, and that it had to be built on something more durable than kinship. His half-brother threatened the household's survival. He learned that internal threats required the same decisiveness as external ones. His captors fitted him with a collar. He learned that captivity was a temporary condition subject to violent reversal. His wife's kidnappers used her against him. He turned the debt into an alliance-building exercise and recovered what was his. Every single reversal, every loss, every humiliation became information, became material, became, in his hands, a draft of the next step. The alliances he built through these years were not random. Togrul's support gave him access to the Kerait military force, one of the strongest on the steppe. His relationship with Jamuga, strained over time by the fundamental incompatibility of two ambitious men in close proximity, nonetheless gave him early credibility as a leader worth following. He was building a coalition using the only currency available to a man with no inherited power: reputation, reciprocity, and the accumulation of demonstrated competence in the specific skills the steppe valued above all others, as military judgment, personal courage, the willingness to share plunder, and to punish disloyalty with equal consistency. He also developed what can only be described as a revolutionary philosophy of recruitment. On the steppe, loyalty flowed through clan lines. You followed your clan's leader because he was your clan's leader, and you fought his enemies because they were your clan's enemies, and you inherited his alliances and his feuds whether you wanted them or not. Temujin broke this, deliberately, systematically at personal risk. He promoted men based on demonstrated ability rather than bloodline. He absorbed defeated enemies into his force rather than killing them wholesale, if they were willing to transfer their allegiance. He made the extraordinary promise on the steppe that what a man earned through his service to Temujin would actually be his, that talent, not birth, was the basis of advancement. This was not idealism. It was engineering. He was designing a recruitment system that would pull the best available human material toward him and away from his rivals, regardless of tribal origin. The rivals fell, one by one, across the 1190s and early 1200s. The Tatars, the people who had poisoned his father, were defeated and dealt with in a manner that closed that chapter permanently. Jamuha, his old blood brother turned rival, was eventually captured and in one final act of terrible intimacy executed at his own request rather than handed to his enemies. Even Togrul, his early patron, eventually became a threat that had to be neutralized. The steppe ran on this logic. Every alliance was provisional. Every friendship had a shelf life determined by power differentials. Temujin understood this with a clarity that no one else on the steppe quite matched, and he acted on it before his rivals finished calculating whether he would. By 1206, the tribes that had spent generations raiding and destroying each other had been brought to heel or incorporated into a single structure. The surviving leaders and their warriors had been reorganized. You already know the structure: the Arbans and Zuns and Minghans, the decimal system that turned feuding clan fragments into a unified military machine. The reorganization itself was an act of political genius, because it dissolved the old tribal loyalties at their structural level. You were no longer a Keryat warrior, or a Naiman warrior, or a Merkit survivor. You were a member of an Arban, which was part of a Zun, which was part of a Mingan, which was part of a Tumen. Your identity was your unit. Your unit's loyalty was to Temujin. They gathered at the Onon River, the same river where a teenage slave had once lain submerged with only his nose above water, listening to horsemen pass close enough to touch. The white standard with 9 tails, the symbol of the new Mongol state, was raised against the sky. A shaman declared that heaven itself had ordained what was about to happen, and the man who'd been left on the steppe to die at 9 years old, who had hunted down a half-brother at 13, who had escaped a wooden collar by violence, and waded out of a freezing river into freedom, who had built a coalition from nothing using reputation and ruthlessness in roughly equal measure. That man was proclaimed Genghis Khan, Sosta universal ruler. The title was not a metaphor. It was a statement of intent so total that it made every other king and emperor on earth, technically and from Temujin's perspective, a subject who had not yet been informed of the arrangement. What strikes you, standing at the end of this story and looking back over the full arc of it, is not the violence. The steppe was violent. Everyone on it was violent. What strikes you is the conversion rate. How completely, how efficiently, this particular man turned every wound into ammunition. The abandoned 9-year-old does not collapse under grief. He learns that external support is unreliable and that self-sufficiency is survival. The 13-year-old who kills his half-brother is not acting from rage. He's practicing the calculus of resource competition that will eventually govern the management of an empire. The captive in the Kangi does not wait to be rescued. He turns the instrument of his captivity into a weapon, and manufactures his own rescue. The husband whose wife is taken does not absorb the insult. He builds the coalition that recovers her and, in the process, establishes the diplomatic relationships he will need for the next phase of expansion. There is no version of the Mongol Empire that does not run directly through the specific texture of this specific childhood. The machine that destroyed cities and absorbed engineers and sent terrified survivors ahead to soften the next target. That machine was built by someone who learned its fundamental principles not from a military academy, not from a court education, not from reading histories of previous conquerors, but from being the most vulnerable person in one of the world's harshest environments and refusing, with what appears to have been a genuinely extraordinary ferocity of will, to remain that way. On the Onon River in 1206 the ceremony concluded. The white standard caught the wind, the two men commanders knelt, and somewhere in the crowd, or perhaps standing apart from it, was a man who could remember the exact weight of a wooden kang and the exact temperature of river water in the dark. And who had spent his entire adult life making sure he would never need to know those things again. That man was now the most powerful person on earth, and he was only getting started. Here is what nobody tells you about the conquests of Genghis Khan. The targets he chose were not weak. They were not failing states in the process of collapsing on their own. They were not steppe confederacies vulnerable to the same tribal dynamics he had spent decades mastering. Every civilization he turned the Mongol machine toward was, by the standards of the 13th century, genuinely formidable, ancient, wealthy, defended by technology and infrastructure that nomadic horsemen had no business threatening. The Jin dynasty of northern China had 60 million people behind it. 60 million. The entire Mongol population at the time of the 1206 unification was somewhere in the range of 1 to 2 million, and the army that marched south in 1211 numbered perhaps 100,000 soldiers. These are not the odds of a superior force overwhelming an inferior one. These are the odds of something that should not have worked at all. It worked. In 1211, 4 years after the proclamation on the Onon River, Genghis Khan led his reorganized, decimal-structured, psychologically weaponized army across the Gobi Desert and into the territory of the Jurchen Jin dynasty, the rulers of northern China. The Jin were not unprepared. They had walls, the Great Wall system, sections of it, networks of fortified positions stretching across the northern frontier. They had professional armies trained in tactics that had been refined across centuries of Chinese military tradition. They had gunpowder, deployed in early forms as incendiary weapons and explosive devices that nomadic cavalry had never encountered at scale. They had cities built specifically to resist sieges. They had everything on paper that should have made them immune to a steppe invasion of the kind the Mongols represented. What they did not have was a response to an army that learned. This is the point that gets lost in most accounts of the Mongol conquests, which tend to focus on the scale of destruction rather than the mechanism. The Mongol military did not arrive at the Jin frontier with siege capability equal to what it would later demonstrate. It arrived with cavalry superiority, intelligence networks, and an institutional willingness to absorb new knowledge faster than any opponent could anticipate. When those early campaigns against Jin frontier fortifications stalled, because walls simply could not be taken by mounted archers, the Mongol response was not to bat themselves against the obstacle indefinitely. They found the people who knew how to pull walls down, Chinese engineers who understood the mechanics of siege machinery, counterweight trebuchets, traction catapults, scaling equipment, tunnel collapse techniques, were recruited or captured. Recruited where possible, because a willing expert is more useful than a coerced one. Captured where necessary, because the alternative was leaving the knowledge in enemy hands. Within a single campaign season, either the army that had never conducted a major siege was conducting them with a sophistication that surprised the defenders behind those walls. The Mongols did not bring their own siege doctrine. They stole the enemy's and deployed it back at them with terrifying efficiency. This pattern, absorb, adapt, apply, is the single most important thing to understand about every conquest that follows. The machine did not win because it was unchanging. It won because it changed faster than its victims. By 1213, Mongol forces had penetrated deep into Jin territory, moving through the frontier defences and fanning out across the North China Plain in multiple columns. The devastation across this period is recorded by Chinese chroniclers in terms that strain comprehension. Villages erased, agricultural infrastructure dismantled, populations either killed or displaced in numbers that made entire regions functionally uninhabitable. Genghis Khan was not trying to administer these territories in this phase. He was reducing their capacity to resist, converting populated productive land into a landscape of ruin that would take generations to recover, while simultaneously extracting everything portable and useful. Then came Zhongdu. Zhongdu, the city that would eventually become Beijing, the capital of the Jin dynasty, the administrative centre of a civilization that had endured for more than a century, fell in 1215. The siege was not quick. The Jin court had fortified the city thoroughly, and it held for a period that tested even the Mongols' patience and logistics. But the Jin position was ultimately untenable. Supply lines were cut. The surrounding countryside, which should have fed the city, had been systematically stripped. When the city's defences finally failed and Mongol forces moved through the gates, the scale of what followed was such that Persian chroniclers writing decades later still reach for language that felt inadequate to the reality. Smoke rose from the burning palaces for months. The accounts say months, not days. Fires moving through wooden structures of a density and scale that modern cities have largely abandoned, fed by the accumulated material wealth of a dynasty's capital, burning with a persistence that made the destruction visible from distances that should have put it beyond sight. The Jin court had fled south before the final collapse. Genghis Khan allowed this deliberately. There is a strategic logic in letting a government survive in diminished form. A court in exile is occupied with its own survival and the management of its defeat, rather than organising effective resistance. The Jin would continue to exist technically for another 19 years after the fall of Zhongdu, but they would never recover the initiative. The northern capital was gone. The psychological centre of their state had been reduced to months of smoke visible from the steppe. Among the things the Mongols took from Zhongdu were people, specifically administrators, scholars, craftsmen, engineers with skills that had no Mongol equivalent. The man who had become Genghis Khan's most important civilian advisor, Yelu Chukai, a Khitan scholar who had served the Jin court, was taken from Zhongdu and, over time, Sui became indispensable to the management of conquered territories that the Mongols otherwise had no framework for governing. This matters because it illustrates something the traditional narrative of Mongol conquest consistently underweights. The army took cities, but it was the absorbed specialists, Chinese administrators, Persian logistics experts, Uyghur scribes who provided the Mongols with their first real writing system for bureaucratic purposes, who made the empire administratively functional in the aftermath of conquest. The Mongols were, in a very real sense, running their empire on borrowed expertise from the moment they had an empire to run. The Jin campaign was ongoing when Genghis Khan's attention pivoted westward, and not because the Jin were finished, they were not, but because something had happened on the other side of the world that made the western flank not just an opportunity, but an obligation. The Khwarezmian Empire occupied what is today Iran, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, and parts of Iraq and Pakistan. At its height in the early 13th century, it was one of the wealthiest political entities on Earth, controlling the central corridors of overland trade between China and the Mediterranean. Its cities, Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, Urgench, were among the most sophisticated urban centres anywhere, repositories of Islamic scholarship, commercial infrastructure, and artistic achievement that represented centuries of accumulated investment. The Khwarezmian Shah, Muhammad II, controlled a population and a military that, on raw numbers, dwarfed anything Genghis Khan commanded. Genghis Khan's initial approach to the Khwarezmian Empire was commercial, not military. Trade caravans moved between Mongol territory and Khwarezmian cities. In 1218, a Mongol-sponsored trade mission of roughly 450 merchants crossed into Khwarezmian territory, carrying goods valued at an amount the sources describe as extraordinary. Silks, furs, gold and silver, goods accumulated from the conquest of northern China. This was not just commerce, it was a diplomatic signal. Genghis Khan understood that the Silk Road's value depended on political stability across its entire length. A trading relationship with the Khwarezmian Empire was worth more in sustained economic terms than a war that would destroy the infrastructure generating the wealth. The Khwarezmian governor of the border city of Otrar looked at 450 merchants, evaluated their cargo, and made a decision that stands as one of history's most consequential miscalculations. He accused them of spying and had them executed, every one of them. Then he took the goods. Genghis Khan sent a diplomatic envoy to Muhammad II requesting justice, the punishment of the governor at Otrar, reparations, a formal acknowledgement that what had been done violated the established protocols of trade and diplomacy. Muhammad II executed the lead envoy and sent the surviving members of the delegation back with their beards shaved, a deliberate, culturally specific humiliation that communicated exactly what the Shah thought of Mongol diplomatic standing. The response to this, from the man who had spent his entire life converting insults into strategic fuel, was not immediate or impulsive. Genghis Khan reportedly retreated alone to a mountain for 3 days. The sources interpret this as prayer or spiritual consultation, or both. What emerged from those 3 days was a decision so absolute that it changed the geography of human civilization. He was going west, not with a raiding party, not with a punitive column, with everything. 200,000 soldiers crossed into Khwarezmian territory in 1219. Some accounts put the number higher. The logistics of moving an army of that scale across Central Asia, feeding them, watering the horses, maintaining unit cohesion across hundreds of miles of semi-arid terrain, were a feat of organizational complexity that military historians still analyze with something approaching disbelief. The YAM relay system that kept communication moving, the advanced scouting that had already mapped the roads and water sources and garrison strengths of the Khwarezmian defensive line, the division into multiple operational columns that could strike separately and then converge, preventing the defender from concentrating force against any single threat. Muhammad II made a strategic choice that sealed his empire's fate. Rather than massing his forces and seeking a decisive engagement, which given his numerical strength might have offered at least a chance, he distributed his army across his cities and fortresses, planning to defend everything simultaneously. This is the same logic that feels intuitive and proves catastrophically wrong. When you defend everywhere, you are strong nowhere. When Mongol columns arrived before each city in sequence, the local garrison faced the full weight of a Mongol army. The distributed force that might have mattered as a concentrated field army was instead consumed piecemeal, fortress by fortress, city by city, each one falling in isolation while the rest waited for an attack that arrived before relief could. Bukhara was taken in February 1220. The city's garrison made a break for it and was ridden down on the open steppe, exactly the terrain where Mongol cavalry was most lethal and fortification was irrelevant. The civilian population of Bukhara surrendered. What happened next is recorded by Atamalik Juvaini, a Persian historian who wrote about the Mongol conquests from within the conquered world, and whose account carries the weight of someone trying to describe events that still did not feel entirely real decades after they occurred. Juvaini describes the people of Bukhara driven out of the city into the surrounding plain, the mosques, palaces, and administrative buildings searched and stripped, then the fires. The great library of Bukhara, one of the finest collections of Islamic scholarship in the world, built across generations of caliphal patronage and scholarly dedication, was emptied into the central square. Books carried out by armfuls piled in the open and burned. Not the books alone, the physical infrastructure of learning. the manuscripts that recorded mathematical advances, astronomical observations, philosophical commentary, medical knowledge accumulated across the Islamic Golden Age, the specific, irreplaceable record of how one of the world's most sophisticated civilizations had thought about the universe, burned in an afternoon. The smoke rose and mixed with the smoke from the burning buildings, and the whole of it drifted across the steppe toward the horizon, while the population of the city stood at the edge of the firelight and understood that nothing would be the same. Genghis Khan rode into the central mosque of Bukhara and addressed the surviving population from the pulpit. This detail from Giovanni carries a particular weight. The mosque's pulpit was the seat of religious and moral authority in Islamic civic life, and the man standing at it was a Tengrist from the Mongolian steppe who had just destroyed the city's library. He told them that he had come as the punishment of God. His exact words, as Giovanni records them, "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." Read that statement carefully. It is not the declaration of a conqueror celebrating his own power. It is something stranger and more unsettling. It is the assertion that what has just happened is cosmically justified, that the destruction is not arbitrary, but is the fulfillment of a divine logic that the victims themselves, through their sins, have set in motion. He is not taking responsibility for Bukhara's destruction. He is explaining that Bukhara's destruction is Bukhara's fault, and that he is merely the instrument through which an indifferent heaven has expressed its judgment. Whether he believed this or had simply identified the most psychologically devastating possible framing for a conquered population, the effect was the same. It removed from the survivors any foothold of moral resistance. Their city had not been destroyed by an enemy. It had been punished by a force they themselves had called down. Samarkand fell within weeks of Bukhara, the city that had been one of the great crossroads of the medieval world, that had stood at the intersection of trade routes connecting China to the Mediterranean for centuries, surrendered after a siege that lasted only a few days, once the Mongol siege machinery, the machinery that had been assembled and refined through the Jin campaigns, operated by Chinese and Persian engineers who now served a Mongolian master, was brought to bear. The surviving population was sorted. Craftsmen and specialists were separated from the general population and conscripted into Mongol service. Soldiers who had defected from the garrison in hopes of favourable treatment were executed regardless, because Genghis Khan had established and consistently enforced the principle that a man who betrays his master once will betray his new master when it becomes convenient. The population that remained was driven to the outskirts, and the city was systematically looted. Merv, one of the largest cities in the Islamic world, some estimates put its pre-conquest population at close to 500,000 people, fell in 1221 and suffered a fate that the sources record with a completeness that makes it almost impossible to process. The population was driven onto the plain. A count was taken. Then the killing began, organised by unit in the Mongol decimal structure, each soldier assigned a numerical quota. The count continued for days. The Persian sources record numbers that modern historians debate but cannot dismiss, figures in the hundreds of thousands. The great irrigation infrastructure of the Merv oasis, the underground Qanat channels that had made one of the world's most productive agricultural regions possible in semi-arid terrain, was destroyed. A city does not fall when its walls come down. A city dies when the system that feeds it is dismantled. And Merv's system was dismantled so completely that the region did not recover its pre-conquest population levels for centuries. Muhammad II himself, the Shah who had ordered the execution of the trade mission and the humiliation of the diplomatic envoy, fled. Genghis Khan detached a special force, 20,000 soldiers under two of his best generals, Jebe and Subutai, with a single mission: find him. Regardless of where he went, regardless of what territory they crossed, find him and end the dynasty at its source. Muhammad II fled west and then north, chased from city to city, unable to stop and unable to gather a force capable of turning on his pursuers. He died on a small island in the Caspian Sea in late 1220 of pleurisy, alone, reportedly unable to afford proper burial clothing. The ruler of one of the wealthiest empires on earth, dead in rags on a cold island, hunted to his end by men who never stopped moving. His son Jalal ad-Din attempted to organise resistance and managed to inflict one of the few tactical reverses the Mongols suffered during this period at the Battle of Parwan in 1221. Genghis Khan responded personally, hunting Jalal ad-Din to the banks of the Indus River, where the last Khwarezmian heir plunged into the current on horseback and escaped into India. Genghis Khan reportedly watched him go and expressed something the sources describe as admiration. He did not pursue him across the Indus. India would wait. The destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire between 1219 and 1221 represents one of the most rapid and complete dismantlings of a major civilization in recorded history. Less than 2 years, an empire that had taken a century to build, that controlled some of the most productive land and most important trade routes in the world, or that housed hundreds of thousands of people in some of the most sophisticated cities human beings had yet constructed, gone in less than 24 months. The cities were not merely captured. Many of them ceased to function as cities at any meaningful level for generations. The population loss across the Iranian plateau during this period is estimated, with all the uncertainty that medieval demographic reconstruction involves, at somewhere between 10 and 15 million people. Numbers that are contested, that cannot be verified with precision, but that are consistent with what the physical archaeology and the contemporary accounts both suggest about the scale of what happened. And here is the thing that makes the vertigo complete, the thing that keeps you staring at the ceiling turning it over. This was not the end. The Jin dynasty is still technically surviving in southern China, had years of reckoning left ahead of it. The armies that Jibin Subutai were commanding in the pursuit of Muhammad II were simultaneously scouting the territory west of the Caspian, mapping the roads into Russia, gathering intelligence on the Rus principalities, and the Cuman steppe in preparation for campaigns that had not been ordered yet but would be. The machine, while dismantling one of the world's great civilizations, was already collecting information about the next one. Genghis Khan was 60 years old when Khwarezm fell. He had been the universal ruler for 13 years. He had conquered more territory in those 13 years than the Roman Empire accumulated across centuries. And on his deathbed, 6 years later, and the campaign he would outline with his final breath would be about outflanking enemies he had not yet fought, through territories he had not yet seen. He did not stop calculating, not at 60, not on his deathbed. The punishment of God did not retire. The man who had remade the world died in a siege camp, not in battle, not on the open steppe where he had spent the formative decades of his life, not in one of the great cities he had burned, or the courts of the enemies he had hunted to their ends. August 18th, 1227, and the 65-year-old Genghis Khan, the universal ruler, the punishment of God, the man who had been left for dead on the steppe as a 9-year-old, and had responded by conquering 12 million square miles, was camped outside Yinchuan, the capital of the Western Xia. The Tangut kingdom he had been grinding down for the better part of 2 years in what would be his final campaign. He had fallen from his horse. The sources offer different explanations for what happened next. A hunting accident, a fever, wounds sustained in battle, the accumulated weight of a body that had been pushed beyond reasonable limits for 6 decades. The secret history of the Mongols, the closest thing to an official account of his life compiled by the Mongols themselves, records that on his deathbed he was still working, still thinking. He dictated a military strategy in his final hours, a plan to outflank the Jin dynasty by moving through the territory of the southern Song, using Song roads and Song geography to strike the Jin from a direction they would not anticipate. Completing the conquest he had started 16 years earlier in northern China. He outlined this plan from a camp bed outside a city he had not yet taken, on the day he was dying. with the precision of a man who did not recognize the concept of stopping. Then he died. What happened next reveals something about the Mongol world that no chronicle of battlefield victories quite captures. The death of Genghis Khan was concealed, not announced, not mourned publicly, not marked with any of the ceremonies that the death of the world's most powerful ruler might be expected to generate. The body was loaded onto a cart, wrapped and secured, and the column that transported it back across the steppe toward Mongolia moved under conditions of absolute operational secrecy. Anyone who witnessed the passage of that cart, travellers encountered on the road, herdsmen who saw the column from a distance, anyone whose eyes registered what they were seeing, was killed. The sources say this plainly. Witnesses were eliminated to prevent the knowledge of the Khan's death from reaching enemies who might use the transition period as an opening, to prevent premature succession struggles, to protect the secrecy of what was coming next, the burial itself. The burial site was chosen in Mongolia, in a location that the sources are deliberately vague about, somewhere near his birthplace, somewhere in the sacred landscape of the steppe that had produced him. What is clear is that the concealment was total and violent. Trees were planted over the site, the soil was turned. Her horses were driven back and forth across the ground to obliterate any trace of digging. And then the men who had done the work, the men who had dug the grave and lowered the body and replaced the earth and planted the trees and driven the horses, were themselves killed. And the men responsible for killing them were, by some accounts, also killed. The circle of knowledge was contracted through murder until the precise location of the grave existed in the memory of no living person. 800 years later, it still has not been found. Satellite imaging has scanned the terrain. Ground-penetrating radar has been deployed. Archaeological expeditions backed by both Mongolian and international resources have searched the region around the Khenti Mountains, where most scholars believe the burial was made. Nothing. The deliberate erasure was so complete that the most sophisticated remote sensing technology available in the 21st century cannot locate what was hidden in the 13th. Think about that scale of secrecy. The ruler of the largest empire on earth is buried somewhere, and the location has been successfully concealed for 8 centuries, not by geological accident or the passage of time, but by a plan executed with the same systematic thoroughness as every military campaign he ever ran. The empire he left behind did not pause to grieve. There was a transitional period, a Kurultai, an assembly of the Mongol nobility and leadership, had to be convened to formally elect the next great Khan. This took 2 years. In the interim, the empire operated, the armies held their positions, the administrative systems continued to function. The machine was larger than any single operator. When the Kurultai finally convened in 1229, the election of Ögedei, Genghis Khan's third son and his chosen successor, was ratified by the assembled leadership. Ögedei was not his father. He was heavy drinking, more inclined to pleasure than to the ascetic campaign life Genghis Khan had maintained into old age, and possessed of a temperament that was in many ways the opposite of his father's focused, relentless quality. He was also, despite all of this, an extraordinarily capable administrator and strategist who understood the empire as a system to be managed rather than simply a force to be pointed at enemies. Within months of his election, the system was accelerating in every direction simultaneously. The Jin dynasty, already shattered by 16 years of Mongol pressure, he still technically existed in southern China, where the court had fled after the fall of Zhongdu in 1215. Ögedei launched the final campaign in 1231. By this point the Jin were defending not a functioning empire but a memory of one, territory stripped of northern China, a court that had been running on momentum and desperation for nearly 2 decades, an army that had been fighting a losing war for longer than most of its soldiers had been alive. The final conquest took 3 years. In 1234, the last Jin emperor, surrounded and with no exit remaining, committed suicide. The Jin dynasty, which had ruled northern China for more than a century and counted 60 million people within its territory at the time the Mongols first crossed its frontier, ceased to exist. The human cost of the entire conquest sequence, from the first Mongol incursions in 1211 through the final collapse in 1234, is one of the most debated demographic questions in medieval history. The estimates that historians have generated, working backward from census records, from the collapse of agricultural output recorded in surviving administrative documents, from the archaeological evidence of abandoned settlements and silted irrigation systems, converge on numbers that are genuinely difficult to hold in your mind as referring to human beings rather than abstractions. Some estimates put the death toll in China across the conquest period, through battle, famine, displacement, and the cascading collapse of agricultural systems, at approximately 35 million people. 35 million. The population of the entire Mongol homeland at the time of the 1206 unification was somewhere between 1 and 2 million. The conquerors were outnumbered by their dead by a ratio that defies the categories we normally use to think about military conflict. Whatever word applies to what happened in northern China between 1211 and 1234, whatever conceptual framework is adequate to that scale of destruction, it is not a word that gets used in the same sentence as standard military history. While the Jin campaign was grinding to its conclusion, Ogadai had already authorized the western expansion. The target was Russia, or more precisely, the Russian principalities, because Russia in 1236 was not a unified state, but a collection of semi-independent city-states and regional powers, each with its own prince, that each capable of military resistance, and none of them coordinated into anything that could mount a collective defence. This fragmentation was not a secret to the Mongols. Subutai, the general who had chased Muhammad II across the Caspian and had commanded at the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223, where a Mongol force of roughly 20,000 had destroyed a combined Rus-Kuman army, estimated at several times that size through a feigned retreat that turned a Russian pursuit into a massacre, had been studying the Russian principalities for 13 years. The Kalka River engagement was not just a victory. It was a reconnaissance in force, a probe that gathered intelligence about Russian tactics, Russian political structure, Russian terrain, and Russian capacity for collective response. The answer to that last question had been, in 1223, the essentially zero. The principalities had sent forces but coordinated almost nothing. When the Mongols turned and counterattacked, the result was a rout so complete that the captured Russian princes were executed by being laid flat and crushed beneath wooden boards, while the victorious Mongol officers held a banquet on top of them. A death that spilled no noble blood, in keeping with Mongol ritual tradition about how royalty should be killed. By 1236, Subutai's intelligence network had done what Subutai's intelligence networks always did. It had mapped everything, every road into the principalities, every river crossing, every city's garrison strength, every fortification's weaknesses, every political tension between the princes that might prevent coordinated resistance. The army that crossed into Russian territory in the winter of 1237 numbered approximately 150,000 soldiers under the nominal command of Batu Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson and the nominal head of the Western campaign, with Subutai as the operational mind directing the actual strategy. The choice of winter for the invasion was deliberate and reveals something important about how differently the Mongols thought about military logistics. European and Russian armies of this period generally campaigned in warmer months when foraging was possible, when rivers were crossable, when roads were not frozen. Winter was the time when armies stood down. The Mongols looked at a Russian winter and saw an advantage. The rivers froze solid, converting natural barriers into highways for the cavalry. The flat white landscape of snow offered no cover for defenders trying to intercept fast-moving Mongol columns. The fodder problem, feeding horses in a landscape stripped of summer vegetation, was addressed by the Mongol practice of driving massive herds of remounts alongside the army, maintaining a reserve of horseflesh that allowed the cavalry to sustain its pace even when grazing was impossible. They were, in a very real sense, more comfortable operating in conditions that their enemies considered prohibitive. The Russian winter, which has stopped so many subsequent invaders, was a weapon the Mongols turned in their own hands. Ryazan fell first. The city sent to the other principalities for help and received none, each prince calculating disastrously that the Mongol column was someone else's problem, that the attack was local. That cooperation carried its own political costs. Ryazan's garrison fought and the city was taken and burned. Then Kolomna. Then Moscow, at this point a modest settlement rather than the capital it would later become. Then Vladimir, the seat of the Grand Prince of Vladimir Suzdal, one of the most powerful of the Russian principalities. Vladimir's walls were taken by siege machinery assembled on the spot from timber, cut from the surrounding forests, operated by engineers who'd been doing this for 20 years across China and Central Asia. The Grand Prince fled north. His family, sheltering in the city's cathedral, was burned alive when Mongol forces set the structure alight. The city itself was reduced to foundations. The campaign moved city by city through the winter of 1237 to 1238, and then again the following winter, each principality falling in sequence, none managing to coordinate with its neighbours in time to matter. In 1240, Kiev, the oldest and historically most prestigious of the Russian cities, the symbolic heart of Rus civilization, a city with roots stretching back to the 9th century, was surrounded and taken. A Franciscan friar named Giovanni da Pian del Carpin, travelling through the region several years later on a papal diplomatic mission, described what he found: fields of bones, skulls and rib cages bleaching in the open, the structures gone, the population dispersed or dead. The city that had been one of the major urban centres of medieval Europe reduced to something he struggled to describe as a city at all. He counted perhaps 200 houses still standing in a place that had held tens of thousands of people. By the end of 1240, Russia was subjugated. Not administered. The Mongols would not directly administer Russian territory in the way they administered China and Persia, preferring instead to impose tribute obligations on surviving Russian princes who would govern locally on Mongol terms, but subjugated in the absolute sense that meaningful military resistance had been eliminated, and the political structure of the principalities now existed at the pleasure of the Great Khan's court in Karakorum. Subutai had been planning the next phase for months. Western Europe in early 1241 was not ignorant of the Mongols. Rumours had reached the courts of Poland, Hungary and the Holy Roman Empire for years. Fragmentary reports, refugee accounts. The terrifying stories carried west by survivors of the Russian campaign and by Cuman nomads who had been displaced from the steppe by the Mongol advance and had appealed to Hungarian King Bela IV for asylum. King Bela had accepted them, approximately 40,000 Cuman warriors and their families, settling them in Hungarian territory, a decision that would complicate Hungarian politics at the worst possible moment. The rulers of Europe understood, in a general sense, that something was coming from the east. What they didn't understand, could not have understood because nothing in their strategic experience had prepared them for it, was the scale and the coordination of what Subutai had designed. He split the army, not into two roughly equal forces pointed at the same objective, into multiple independent operational columns assigned different targets separated by hundreds of miles, all synchronized to strike within days of each other so that no defender could assess the full picture before it was too late to respond to any part of it. One column drove north into Poland. A second column drove west into Hungary. A third column secured the northern flank in a sweeping arc through the Carpathian passes. Each column was independently powerful enough to destroy any force that could reasonably be assembled against it in the time available. Together they created a strategic situation where European rulers receiving word of the attack in one direction had no way to know that the attack was also coming from another direction and another and another. The northern column reached Poland in the first days of April 1241. A Polish army under Henry II, the Duke of Silesia, gathered at Legnica along with German knights from the Teutonic Order Knights Templar, and forces from several German states. This was not a small force. It was one of the most concentrated assemblies of heavy cavalry that Central Europe could produce on short notice. Armoured knights representing the military technology in which European warfare had invested enormously across the preceding century. The armoured horseman on a warhouse being the standard conception of decisive military force in Western tactical thinking. On April 9th, 1241, at the Battle of Legnica, it was destroyed in hours. The precise details of the tactical engagement at Legnica are disputed across the sources, but the outcome is not. The Mongol force, smaller, more lightly armoured, are tactically faster, used the feigned retreat that had been refined through decades of open steppe warfare, and then systematically adapted to different terrain. The smoke screens deployed during the battle, burning materials generating thick clouds that confused the Polish-German cavalry sense of the engagement, are reported by multiple chroniclers and suggest a level of deliberate psychological disorientation layered on top of the basic tactical plan. Henry II died in the fighting. The sources record that his head was displayed on a lance outside the city of Legnica afterward, and that the ears of the Christian dead were collected in bags, 9 bags by one count, as a record of the killing for the Mongol commander's reports back to Subutai. On the same day, the same April 9th, 1241, 250 miles to the southeast, at the Sazho River in Hungary, the second column was completing the destruction of the Hungarian army at the Battle of Mohi. King Bela IV had assembled a force that outnumbered the Mongols confronting him. He had positioned his army in a fortified camp on the western bank of the Sazho, his cavalry on the nearby bridge, confident that the river obstacle provided security for his flank and that his numbers provided security for the rest. Subutai had spent the night building artillery, not metaphorically. Literally in the darkness on the east bank of the Sazho, Mongol engineers working through the hours before dawn constructed catapults from timber, carried or cut for the purpose, assembled and positioned to cover the bridge approaches with projectile fire. When the Hungarians on the bridge became aware of Mongol forces attempting to cross in the pre-dawn darkness and moved to contest it, the catapults opened fire. This was not expected. Artillery defending a river crossing deployed overnight, ready to fire at first light. This was not a capability the Hungarians had any intelligence about. The bridge crossing was forced under fire. Simultaneously, Subutai took a separate force on a wide arc south, found an undefended crossing point downstream, and appeared on the Hungarian flank at dawn, with a force that the defenders had not known existed. The third prong of the assault hit the main camp from a direction that its fortifications were not oriented to resist. Roger of Torre Maggiore, a canon who survived the battle and wrote an account afterward, or as described the Hungarian army compressed against the river, men drowning in armour trying to escape across water that offered no escape. The cavalry that had seemed so formidable in the camp the previous night shattered within hours, the pursuit going on until there was nothing left to pursue. He wrote that for 2 days afterward the river ran red with blood. Bela IV escaped on horseback and was chased across Hungary and into the Adriatic coast of Croatia. The man who had given asylum to the Cumans, who promptly departed Hungarian territory in the chaos following the defeat, stripping him of the military force he had accepted them to provide, rode for his life through his own collapsing kingdom. By the end of April 1241, Poland had been devastated, Hungary was occupied, and Mongol advance riders were conducting patrols that reportedly reached the outskirts of Vienna. The remaining rulers of Europe, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, the King of France, the Pope, were composing letters to each other and to Mongol commanders attempting to understand what was happening and how to stop it. They had no answer. There was no force remaining in Western Europe that could meet what was in Hungary and survive the encounter. The military arithmetic was simply not there. Then everything stopped. December 11th, 1241. In Karakorum, the Mongol capital under construction on the Central Asian steppe, 5,000 miles from the Sazho River, Ogedei Khan died. He was 46 years old. The cause recorded in the sources was excessive drinking. The accumulated cost of a lifestyle that had been conspicuously excessive, even by the standards of a court that had access to the wine and distilled spirits of a dozen conquered civilizations. The death was not sudden in the medical sense. Ögedei had been unwell for some time, his health declining in ways that were visible to those around him. But the moment of death, December 11th, was the moment the system responded. Batu Khan received the news in his winter camp in Hungary. He was the senior Mongol commander in the Western Theatre. The Empire's law was clear on what had to happen next. A Kurultai had to be convened to elect the new Great Khan, and the senior members of the royal family and the Empire's leadership were expected to attend. Batu Khan was senior. He could not simply remain in Hungary while a Kurultai proceeded without him. His presence, or at minimum his formal participation through representatives, was required to legitimate the outcome. He turned the army around. The Mongol forces withdrew from Hungary across the spring of 1242. They moved through the Balkans, into Bulgaria, through what is now Romania, back onto the Pontic steppe that was their logistical home territory. They did not leave because they had been defeated. Mohi had been a crushing Mongol victory. They did not leave because they had reached the limits of Mongol military capability, not in any battlefield sense. They left because a succession protocol built into the Empire's governing structure required it. The historians who have examined this withdrawal have identified other factors. Hungary's terrain, denser and more fragmented than the open steppe the Mongol cavalry performed best in. A winter that had been exceptionally harsh, even by Mongol operational standards, with supply lines stretched to their limits across thousands of miles. The Cuman migration that had destabilized Hungary actually complicated Mongol forage. The herds and food stocks the Mongols expected to find in occupied territory had been depleted or scattered, and there are arguments that Batu Khan's own political position within the empire, his relationship with the other senior commanders and with the emerging succession struggle, made rapid return to the Kurultai not just obligatory, but strategically necessary for his own standing. All of these factors may have contributed. None of them changes the fundamental shape of what happened. Western Europe, the kingdoms of France and the Holy Roman Empire, the papacy, the entire civilizational complex that would eventually define European modernity, survived the Mongol moment not because it was strong enough to resist, but because a man 5,000 miles away died on December 11th, 1241, before Batu Khan had finished the campaign. The walls of Vienna were never tested. The knights of France never rode to a sayo of their own. The Gothic cathedrals of the Rhine Valley never watched Mongol columns move through their streets, not because of anything Europe did or could do, but because of a bureaucratic requirement triggered by the death of a heavy-drinking Khan on the other side of the world. The punishment of God had been called home for paperwork, and the world that Genghis Khan had set in motion is that Ögedei had accelerated, that Subutai had systematized with a strategic intelligence that has no clean parallel in the military history of the medieval world. That world kept turning. The Great Khan was dead. The campaign in Europe was suspended. But the empire was still there, still expanding in other directions, still absorbing and adapting and pointing itself at the next target. There were more civilizations to reckon with, more libraries to burn, more caliphs to kill, more maps that Mongol scouts had already drawn in detail that their future enemies did not yet know existed. The machine did not mourn. It never did. There is a city that exists at the center of the medieval Islamic world the way Rome exists at the center of the medieval Christian one. Not just politically, not just administratively, but cosmologically, a place that the civilization orbiting it understands as the axis around which meaning itself rotates. Baghdad, founded in 762 by the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur on the western bank of the Tigris River, in what is now Iraq, designed in a perfect circle, a geometric statement about the order that the Abbasid dynasty intended to impose on the world. By the 9th century it was arguably the largest city on earth, a metropolis of perhaps 1 million people, home to markets where goods from China, India, Persia and the Mediterranean arrived and mixed, and were redistributed across a trade network that spanned continents. The Abbasid Caliphate that governed from it was not merely a political entity. It was the guardian of a religious tradition that stretched back to the 7th century, and the legitimate successor to the Prophet's authority in the understanding of Sunni Islam, the institution through which 500 years of accumulated Islamic scholarship, science, philosophy, and theology had been produced, preserved, and transmitted. At its heart was the House of Wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah. Built up across generations, enlarged and enriched by successive caliphs, the House of Wisdom was not simply a library in the way we use the word now, a place where books are stored on shelves and borrowed and returned. It was a working intellectual institution, a translation bureau, a research centre, a scriptorium, a place where the mathematical texts of ancient Greece arrived in Arabic translation and were then extended and surpassed, where astronomers mapped the sky with a precision that would not be matched in Europe for centuries, where physicians wrote medical encyclopedias that would remain in use across the Islamic world and in European universities well into the Renaissance. The works of Aristotle, of Euclid, of Galen, of Ptolemy, texts that had been composed in Greek and that the Byzantine Christian world had largely set aside, arrived at the House of Wisdom, were translated by scholars fluent in Greek, Persian, Sanskrit and Arabic, and were then worked on, argued with, extended, refined. Algebra was formalized there. The decimal number system as used in the Islamic world found its most sophisticated development there. Astronomical observations that corrected errors in Ptolemy were made there by scholars working with instruments of their own design. The House of Wisdom was not a repository. It was a living engine of intellectual production, and Baghdad was the city that housed it. In January of 1258, Hulagu Khan arrived outside its walls. Hulagu was a grandson of Genghis Khan, a brother of both Kublai Khan and the current Great Khan Möngke, and the commander of the Mongol Western campaign that had been operating with devastating effectiveness across Persia and the Middle East for several years before reaching the Tigris. He was, by the standards of what was about to happen, a man of complicated personal sympathies. His favourite wife, Dox Khatun, was a Nestorian Christian, and Hulagu himself operated within a court where Buddhist, Christian, Tsistast and shamanist traditions coexisted with a practical indifference to theological questions that the empire had maintained since Genghis Khan's time. He was methodical, systematic, and had already destroyed the mountain fortresses of the Nizari Ismaili sect, the so-called Assassins, in 1256, eliminating an organization that had operated as a political terror network across the Islamic world for nearly 2 centuries. His army, assembled outside Baghdad in the first weeks of 1258, was the Mongol Empire's multi-ethnic war machine in its most fully realized form. Chinese siege engineers who had been building and deploying catapults since the Jin dynasty campaigns decades earlier, Persian administrators and logistics specialists who understood the geography, the river systems and the supply chains of Mesopotamia, Armenian Christian cavalry whose presence beside the Mongol forces carried its own theological charge for the Muslim defenders watching from the walls. The army that surrounded Baghdad was not a steppe horde. It was a precision instrument assembled from the accumulated military technology of every civilization the empire had previously consumed. The Abbasid Caliph al-Mustasim received the demand to surrender. He was the 37th caliph in the Abbasid line, a man who had held the title since 1242, and who had watched the Mongol advance across the Islamic world with what the sources suggest was a degree of miscalculation that is difficult to explain except as a failure of imagination. The caliphate had survived political upheaval, regional rebellions, the loss of effective political control over large portions of its nominal territory. It had been, for much of the preceding century, a religious authority whose temporal power was held more in theory than in practice, with actual military and administrative power exercised by local dynasties that acknowledged Abbasid legitimacy as a formality. Perhaps this had shaped al-Mustasim's sense of his own invulnerability. The institution had survived everything else. Perhaps it would survive this. His chief minister, Ibn al-Alqami, a Shia Muslim whose relationship with the Sunni religious establishment was complicated by sectarian tension, reportedly advised surrender. The Caliph rejected the advice. His military commanders reportedly reassured him that Baghdad was defensible, that the Mongol army operating at the far end of its logistical reach would falter before the city's walls and the resistance of its garrison. Those commanders were wrong. They were wrong in ways that the preceding 40 years of Mongol military history should have made obvious, but apparently did not. The siege began in earnest in the first days of February 1258. Hulagu's forces closed around the city on multiple sides. The siege engineers emplaced their machinery, and the catapults that had broken every other fortification in their operational history went to work on Baghdad's walls. The city fought. Sorties were launched. Skirmishes were fought outside the walls. The garrison resisted with the intensity of people defending something they understood to be irreplaceable. None of it was sufficient. The walls that had stood for nearly 5 centuries, that had been reinforced across generations against threats that the men who built them could have imagined, were not designed for what the Mongol siege engineers had learned to deploy. Sections of wall came down. By February 10th, 13 days after the siege had fully begun, Mongol forces were inside Baghdad. What followed across the next week has entered historical memory as one of the signal catastrophes of the medieval world, comparable in its civilizational weight to the sack of Rome in 410 or the destruction of the Temple in Jerusalem. An event whose consequences reverberated not just in the immediate physical destruction, but in what it meant for the tradition it had destroyed. The killing was systematic and enormous. Population estimates for Baghdad in 1258 vary. But the city had been a major metropolis for centuries, and the death toll from the sack is recorded by every major chronicler who addressed it, Muslim, Christian, Persian and Chinese, as staggering. Some sources put the number of dead at figures ranging from several 100,000 into the millions. Numbers that historians treat with caution, because medieval chroniclers routinely exaggerated for rhetorical effect. But that point toward a killing event of extraordinary scale, regardless of where within that range the true number falls. The Persian chronicler Wasaf, writing in the generation after the sack, reached for water imagery to describe what had happened to the Tigris. The river ran black with ink from the thousands of books thrown into it, and red with the blood of the slain. This is the image that has persisted. The two colours bleeding into the river together, because it captures with devastating economy the double nature of what was lost. The physical destruction, the lives, the buildings, the accumulated material civilization of 5 centuries, and the intellectual destruction, the books, the manuscripts, the centuries of scholarship produced and preserved in the House of Wisdom, the unique and irreplaceable records of human thought that burned or sank, or were simply scattered and lost in the chaos of those days. The House of Wisdom itself was destroyed. What exactly happened to its contents during the sack is not recorded with the precision that would allow a full accounting of what was lost. Some manuscripts survived. There are texts that had been in Baghdad that show up in other libraries across the Islamic world in subsequent decades, evacuated by scholars who saw what was coming, or carried away by survivors. But the institution as a functioning entity, the community of scholars, the accumulated archives, the physical infrastructure of the greatest research centre the medieval Islamic world had produced, all of it ended in February 1258. The mathematical and astronomical work that had been done there was not entirely erased from history, because its products had already spread across the Islamic world and beyond. But the living tradition of inquiry centred in that building, the continuity of scholarship that had been sustained for nearly 5 centuries, was severed completely. There is no direct institutional successor to the House of Wisdom. It was not rebuilt. The tradition it embodied scattered into fragments, and some of which survived and some of which were simply gone. Al-Mustasim was taken alive, The Mongols had a tradition that royal blood should not be spilled directly, a belief rooted in the steppe conviction that the soul resided in the blood, and that to spill the blood of a ruler was to release something that could curse the killer. The solution, applied to Caliph al-Mustasim as it had been applied to others before him, was practical in its brutality. He was wrapped in a felt carpet drawn tightly around his body, and cavalry was driven over him. The trampling crushed him to death without technically shedding his blood on the ground. The 37th Caliph of the Abbasid dynasty, the commander of the faithful, the nominal leader of Sunni Islam, he died pressed to death inside a rug somewhere on the outskirts of the city he had refused to surrender. The Abbasid Caliphate had endured for 508 years. It traced its legitimacy in an unbroken line back to the uncle of the Prophet Muhammad. It had survived internal rebellions and external invasions and political fragmentation, and the slow erosion of its temporal power across the preceding century. It had been the symbolic anchor of the Sunni Muslim world through every crisis the medieval Islamic world had faced. It ended in a single week in February 1258, wrapped in carpet and trampled in the dirt outside the ruins of its capital. The psychological shock that this sent through the Islamic world is difficult to overstate. The Caliphate was not merely a political institution. Its destruction was an eschatological event for many Muslims, the kind of catastrophe that religious tradition had associated with the end of ages, with divine judgment, with the unmaking of the order that God had established. Chroniclers writing in the years immediately after 1258 often struggled to find language adequate to what had happened. Some describe the sack of Baghdad in terms previously reserved for the Day of Judgment. Others wrote with a despair that reads across 8 centuries as something close to civilizational trauma. Not just the grief of defeat, but the vertiginous sensation of a world whose foundations had been removed. The Mongol army, having done what it had come to do, moved west. In 1259, following the death of the great Khan Mongol, Hulagu withdrew the majority of his forces eastward to participate in the succession politics that always accompanied a major transition in Mongol leadership. He left a holding force, smaller than the army that had taken Baghdad, but still formidable by any conventional military measure, under a general named Kitbuka. The advance into Syria and Palestine continued. Aleppo fell. Damascus fell. The Ayyubid dynasty, which had once been the house of Saladin, submitted. Christian Crusader states in the Levant watched the Mongol advance with a mixture of terror and something close to hope. Hulagu's Nestorian Christian wife had created diplomatic channels between the Mongol court and the Christian powers, and there were those in the Crusader kingdoms who believed that a Mongol-Christian alliance might together destroy the Sunni Muslim world entirely. None of that came to pass, because in September of 1260, at a place called Ain Jalut, the Spring of Goliath, near Nazareth in what is now northern Israel, something happened that the preceding 50 years of Mongol military history had not produced anywhere, in any theatre, against any opponent. The Mamluks won. The Mamluks were the military slave caste that had governed Egypt since 1250, a dynasty that had risen from the army of the Ayyubids and that had its own experience with the feigned retreat, with coordinated cavalry tactics, with the kind of steppe-influenced mobile warfare that the Mongols had turned into a tool of total dominance. Their commander, Kutuz, even had grown up knowing exactly what the Mongols were and what they did, and had spent years preparing for this confrontation. His cavalry general Baybars, a man who had become one of the most formidable military leaders of the medieval Islamic world in his own right, had studied Mongol tactics with the same systematic thoroughness that Subutai had once applied to studying his opponents. The Mamluk army marched north from Egypt to meet Kitbuka's holding force in Galilee. The numbers were approximately matched, perhaps 20,000 on each side, though the sources vary, which meant that for the first time in the Mongol advance into the Islamic world, the confrontation was not between a Mongol army and a larger defending force that the Mongols could dismantle through superior coordination. It was a genuine tactical contest between two forces of comparable size and similar methods. On September 3, 1260, Baybars led a Mamluk advance that made contact with Kitbuka's force and then retreated, pulling the Mongols forward into a pursuit, drawing them into a valley where the main Mamluk army waited concealed. The feigned retreat. The same tactic that the Mongols had used at the Kalka River, at Legnica, in a dozen other engagements across the preceding decades. The technique refined on the Mongolian steppe, systematized into the doctrine of the most successful military force the medieval world had ever produced. Baybars used it back against them with enough precision that it worked. The Mongol force pressed the apparent retreat, closed into the valley and found itself enveloped. Kitbuka fought with the tenacity the sources consistently attribute to Mongol commanders, and for a period the battle was genuinely uncertain. At one point, a portion of the Mamluk line broke under pressure, and Kutuz, according to the chroniclers, rode into the collapsing section personally to steady his troops. But the envelopment held. The Mongol force was defeated. Kitbuka was captured and executed. Jalut was a Mongol defeat, unambiguous, complete, the first of its kind in the memory of anyone then living. What it revealed was something the preceding decades of uninterrupted victory had obscured. The Mongol military system was extraordinary. It was also not invulnerable, and the vulnerabilities had geography written into them. The steppe cavalry that formed the core of every Mongol army was an organism shaped by and optimized for specific conditions. Open terrain, temperate to cold climate, the ability to sustain horses on the sparse grass of the Eurasian grasslands. The Middle East was not that. The Levant in September is hot in ways that degrade horse performance. The terrain of Palestine and Syria, fragmented by hills and valleys, and the irregular topography of a landscape nothing like the Pontic steppe or the Mongolian plateau, imposes friction on the wide, sweeping cavalry movements that Mongol tactics were built around. The supply chains necessary to support a major Mongol force in that region stretched back thousands of miles to the steppe core of the empire across Persia, through the mountains and deserts of the Near East. A logistical challenge of a different order than sustaining armies operating within a few weeks' ride of the Mongolian homeland. The Mamluks had understood this. They had positioned themselves at the geographic boundary of the steppe cavalry's effective operational range. They had refused to fight on terrain that favoured Mongol mobility. They had assembled an army trained in mobile warfare of their own, without the organisational and doctrinal disadvantages that had crippled every opponent the Mongols had previously faced in open battle. They had used the Mongols' own tactical vocabulary against them in a context where the Mongols could not offset tactical reversal with the logistical and numerical reserves that had saved their engagements in other theatres. The advance that had swept from Mongolia to the gates of Vienna, from Siberia to the Persian Gulf, that had destroyed dynasties and caliphates and entire civilizational complexes, stopped at Ain Jalut and did not restart. The Ilkhanate, the Mongol successor state that Hulagu established in Persia, following the fragmentation of the unified empire, would attempt further incursions into the Levant in subsequent decades, and each one would fail against the Mamluks in circumstances that repeated the fundamental lesson of Ain Jalut. The edge of the steppe was the edge of the steppe cavalry's world. Behind that boundary, to the south and west of where Mongol power reached its functional limit, Egypt remained. Baghdad did not. The city that had been the greatest metropolis of the medieval Islamic world, the city that had housed the House of Wisdom and the Abbasid Caliphate, and 5 centuries of continuous intellectual civilization, sat in ruins on the banks of a river that chroniclers said had run black and red for days after its fall. Al-Mustasim was dead in a carpet. The scholars were dead or scattered. The books were ash or silt at the bottom of the Tigris. The force that had done all of this had just for the first time been beaten by something it could not break. The boundary was not moral or military in the conventional sense. It was geographical, logistical, ecological. The steppe empire had reached the limits of the world its horses could dominate. But everything behind those limits, the vast interior of Eurasia, the lands from China to Persia to Russia, that was already gone, already transformed. already remade into something the world before 1206 would not have recognized and would not begin to understand for generations to come. Here is what nobody told you about the greatest empire in history. The destruction was real. The body counts were real. The ruins of Baghdad, the ash of the House of Wisdom, the depopulated plains of Persia and northern China, all of it real, documented, irreversible. But once the killing stopped, something emerged from the wreckage that historians have spent 2 centuries struggling to categorize. Because it wasn't just an empire of conquest. It was something stranger and more consequential than that. It was the first system in human history that connected the entire Eurasian landmass into a single functioning network. A network so efficient, so deliberately maintained, so comprehensively administered that a Venetian merchant could walk out of his house, travel 4 years overland across mountains and deserts and steppes, and arrive at the court of the most powerful ruler on earth without once crossing a border that would stop him, without once entering territory where the law of the road did not apply. That network had a name, the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. The phrase is not Mongol. It was coined by historians looking backward, borrowing the structure of Pax Romana, the Roman peace, and applying it to the century of relative stability that descended on Eurasia after the conquests were largely complete. It is a phrase that invites a certain irony, because the peace was enforced by people who had very recently demonstrated an unparalleled talent for the opposite of peace. But irony is not inaccuracy. The Pax Mongolica was real. It lasted in various forms from roughly the mid-13th century into the mid-14th century, and during those 100 years, something happened to the Eurasian world that had not happened before and would not happen again until the age of ocean-going exploration fundamentally rewired global trade 3 centuries later. The world got smaller, dramatically, measurably, consequentially smaller. To understand what that meant, you have to understand what the Silk Road was actually like before the Mongols consolidated control over it. The name suggests something unified, a single road with a clear beginning and a clear end, silk travelling steadily in one direction, and silver travelling back in the other. The reality was nothing like that. The Silk Road was a loose, a discontinuous network of regional routes, each controlled by different polities with different legal systems, different tax regimes, different relationships with merchants and travellers. A trader moving goods from China toward the Mediterranean did not make the journey personally. He sold to a middleman, who sold to another middleman, who sold to another. The goods passed through a dozen hands, accumulated a dozen markups, crossed a dozen jurisdictions where the rules changed and the protection varied, and the risk of robbery or extortion or simple political disruption could wipe out the value of a shipment entirely. The silk that arrived in Venice or Constantinople had been handled so many times across such a fragmented landscape that the true point of origin was essentially mythological for the European merchant who finally bought it. The Mongol Empire changed this at a structural level. By the 1250s, the empire controlled an unbroken corridor of territory, stretching from the shores of the Pacific Ocean to the frontier of Eastern Europe. Not almost unbroken, not roughly continuous, literally unbroken, a single political entity operating under a single legal framework, the Yasa that Genghis Khan had codified and that his successors maintained with varying degrees of fidelity, but with consistent emphasis on one particular provision: the protection of merchants and ambassadors travelling under Mongol authority. Merchants who registered with Mongol authorities, who travelled with the appropriate documentation, who paid the appropriate taxes at the appropriate stations. Those merchants moved through the empire under the protection of Mongol law, Ariulf, which was enforced with the same systematic ruthlessness that the Mongols brought to everything else they did. Steal from a protected merchant and the consequences came quickly and were not gentle. This sounds simple. The implications were enormous. For the first time in history, a single merchant could, in principle, make the full journey from China to the Mediterranean under a consistent legal framework. The middlemen didn't disappear entirely. The journey was still too long, too physically demanding, too logistically complex for any single operation to manage end to end. But the number of jurisdictional boundaries a shipment had to cross collapsed dramatically. The number of points where political disruption could terminate a trading venture fell from dozens to almost none. The cost of conducting long-distance trade across Eurasia dropped in ways that allowed goods and people and ideas to move in volumes that the fragmented pre-Mongol Silk Road had never permitted. The yam system made this possible in ways that went beyond simple commerce. The yam, from the Mongolian word for station or road, was the empire's postal relay network, and it was one of the most sophisticated communications infrastructures that the pre-modern world ever produced. The basic principle was straightforward. Stations positioned at intervals of roughly 20 to 30 miles along all major imperial routes, each stocked with fresh horses, food, accommodation for official travellers, and the personnel to maintain the system. A rider carrying imperial dispatches would arrive at a station. He'd hand off his message to a fresh rider on a fresh horse, and that rider would cover the next interval and hand off again. The message moved continuously, day and night, at the speed of galloping horses rather than the speed of exhausted ones. The distances involved make the system almost incomprehensible in scale. The empire at its height stretched approximately 8,000 miles from east to west. The yam system, at its fullest extent under Ugadei and his successors, maintained an estimated 50,000 horses at relay stations across that entire length. Official imperial correspondence could travel from the court of Kublai Khan in China to the Ilkhanate capital in Persia, a distance of roughly 4,000 miles across the most challenging terrain on Earth, in something like 2 weeks. 2 weeks! In a world where a letter from London to Constantinople might take months, where the administrative challenge of governing territory more than a few weeks' ride from the capital was essentially unsolvable, the Mongol Empire had built something that functioned like a nervous system, carrying information from the periphery to the centre, and commands from the centre to the periphery with a speed that no contemporary political entity could approach. The yam was not open to everyone. It existed primarily for imperial communications and for the use of travellers holding a paisa, a tablet of authority issued by Mongol rulers that granted the holder the right to claim horses, food and lodging at relay stations along the route. The paisa system created a class of officially sanctioned travellers who could move through the empire with a speed and security that would have seemed miraculous to anyone who had tried to make the same journey a generation earlier. Ambassadors, tax collectors, military couriers, and increasingly merchants and travellers who had obtained the right documents through the appropriate channels. One of those travellers left a record. In 1271, a 17-year-old Venetian named Marco Polo left his home city with his father Niccolo and his uncle Maffeo, both experienced merchants who had already made one journey east into Mongol-controlled territory. They were not the first Europeans to reach the Mongol court. The Franciscan friar William of Rubruck had made the journey in 1253 and left a detailed account. They, Niccolo and Maffeo, had themselves visited Kublai Khan's court in the 1260s, returning to Venice in 1269 with an invitation to come back. This second journey took them 3.5 years. They crossed Persia, traversed the highlands of what is now Afghanistan, pushed through the Pamir Mountains, the roof of the world, crossed the Taklimakan Desert along its northern edge, and finally emerged into China, arriving at Kublai Khan's summer palace at Chengdu in 1275. The journey was extraordinary, but the fact that it was possible at all was the product of the Pax Mongolica. The roads Marco Polo travelled were patrolled. The caravanserais where he rested, those walled way stations that provided food and shelter and security for travellers along the route, were stocked and functioning. The political situation across the entire length of the route, from the Ilkhanate through the Chagatai Khanate and into Yuan China, was stable enough that a foreign merchant travelling with the right documentation could make the transit without being robbed, detained, or killed by the political authority of whatever territory he happened to be crossing that week. None of this was guaranteed in a world without the Mongols. All of it was a product of the empire's deliberate maintenance of the Silk Road as a functional system. What Marco Polo found at the other end of that journey was Kublai Khan's China, and it deserves a moment of genuine attention. Kublai Khan had declared the Yuan dynasty in 1271, formally establishing Mongol rule over China within the administrative and institutional framework of Chinese imperial tradition. This was not a casual decision. It represented something genuinely unprecedented, the most powerful steppe nomadic ruler in history deliberately choosing to govern the world's most sophisticated administrative state, not by imposing Mongol customs on it, but by adopting Chinese governance structures wholesale. The civil service examinations that had staffed the Chinese bureaucracy for centuries were modified but maintained. Chinese administrative records and legal procedures continued to operate. The capital was moved to Khanbalik, the city the Mongols had rebuilt on the ruins of the Jin dynasty's Zhongdu, the city that would eventually become Beijing, and it was built on a scale that reflected both Mongol ambition and Chinese urban tradition. Kublai Khan governed approximately 60 million people in China alone. Then, to put that in context, the entire population of Europe at the time was somewhere around 75 million. The Yuan dynasty administered more human beings than existed in the entirety of the continent that was simultaneously terrified of Mongol power. The steppe nomad, the descendant of a tradition that medieval European and Chinese chroniclers alike described as barbaric, as the antithesis of civilization, was ruling the most sophisticated administrative state on earth, staffing his government with Confucian scholars and Chinese bureaucrats, presiding over an economy of paper money and sophisticated credit instruments, and patronizing a court culture that mixed Mongolian, Chinese, Persian, Tibetan Buddhist and Nestorian Christian traditions into something that had no real precedent in human history. Our Marco Polo was astonished by it. His account of Kublai Khan's court describes paper money, the flying money, as the Chinese had called it, a technology of economic administration so alien to European commercial tradition that readers back in Venice initially dismissed it as fantasy. He describes the postal relay system, the roads, the bridges, the cities. He describes a China that in material wealth and administrative sophistication made the most advanced European states look underdeveloped by comparison. Whether every detail of his account is accurate is a debate that has occupied scholars for centuries. But the fundamental picture he paints of an empire east of the Mongol conquests that had not collapsed into barbarism, but had instead been integrated into a functioning, sophisticated, enormously wealthy administrative state, is supported by every other source that addressed the Yuan dynasty from the outside. The empire's role as a conduit was not incidental, it was structural. Chinese paper-making technology, the method of producing paper from plant fibers that Chinese craftsmen had refined across centuries, moved west along the Silk Road during the Mongol period. Islamic mathematicians had already encountered it and adopted it before the Mongol conquests, but the empire's maintenance of the Silk Road accelerated the transmission. Printing technology, the block printing methods that had been in use in China since at least the 7th century, moved west across the same network. Gunpowder, which Chinese military engineers had been developing into weapons for 2 centuries before the Mongol conquests, arrived in the Islamic world and then in Europe through the routes that Mongol security had reopened. The compound bow designs that had made Mongol cavalry so devastatingly effective were studied and adapted by military engineers across the empire's periphery. Moving in the opposite direction, Islamic mathematics, the algebra formalized by al-Khwarizmi in 9th century Baghdad, the trigonometry and astronomical calculation that Islamic scholars had developed in the centuries of the House of Wisdom's operation, travelled east into Yuan China, where Persian and Central Asian scholars served at Kublai Khan's court, alongside Chinese and Mongolian advisors. The astronomical instruments that Persian scientists had developed, only the spherical astrolabes and the sophisticated observational methods that represented the leading edge of medieval celestial science, found their way into Chinese astronomical practice through the movement of individual scholars across the Mongol communications network. The cross-pollination was not metaphorical. It was physical. People moved across the empire with a freedom that had not existed before, carrying in their heads and in their baggage the specific technical knowledge of their specific traditions, and depositing that knowledge in places where it encountered and hybridized with the specific knowledge of completely different traditions. A Persian astronomer at Kublai Khan's court was not simply a curiosity. He was a vector for the transmission of a scientific tradition from one civilization to another, operating in a context where the Mongol court's deliberate cultivation of expertise from every conquered civilization created a genuine multicultural intellectual environment. The 1254 interfaith debate organised by Mongol Khan at Karakorum illustrates this tendency in its most explicit form. Mongol, the great Khan whose death would trigger the fragmentation that eventually produced the Ilkhanate and the Yuan dynasty as separate entities, invited representatives of Buddhism, Christianity and Islam to a formal debate at the Mongol capital. The Christian representative was William of Rubruck, the Franciscan friar whose travel account is one of the most detailed European descriptions of the Mongol court. The debate was conducted through interpreters in a setting that included Buddhist monks, Nestorian Christians, and Muslim scholars simultaneously, with the Mongol court observing as an audience. Whether Mongol was motivated by genuine philosophical curiosity or by the political theatre of demonstrating his court's tolerance to every religious tradition his empire encompassed is a question historians still argue. Probably both. The debate itself ended inconclusively, with all parties claiming victory and nobody converted. But the fact that it happened at all, that the ruler of the largest empire in human history organised a structured interfaith theological discussion in the middle of the Mongolian steppe in 1254, says something important about what the Mongol Empire had become. It was not what its enemies had said it was. It was not simply a force of destruction moving across the world and leaving nothing behind. It was something more complicated and in some ways more disturbing, a political entity capable of extraordinary violence and extraordinary accommodation simultaneously, destroying civilizations and then administering the ruins with borrowed tools, killing scholars and then employing their successors at the imperial court, burning libraries and then patronizing the cross-civilization exchange of the knowledge those libraries had contained. The Pax Mongolica made commerce possible at a scale that previous Eurasian history had not seen. It made travel possible across distances that would have been politically and logistically unthinkable a century earlier. It made the movement of ideas and technologies and people across the entire length of the Old World not merely possible but routine. And it did all of this across a century during which, if you were a merchant travelling the roads or a scholar moving between courts, the experience of Eurasian connectivity must have felt like living in a genuinely new kind of world. And then, in those same roads, in those same caravanserais, moving along those same efficiently maintained relay stations and trade routes, something else began to travel. The bacterium is called Yersinia pestis. It causes bubonic plague, and it had been living in the rodent populations of Central Asia, the ground squirrels and marmots and other small mammals of the steppe ecosystem, for a very long time before the Mongol conquests. Plague is not a Mongol invention. The disease existed in the region's animal reservoirs before Genghis Khan was born, but the Mongol Empire built the infrastructure that allowed it to reach Europe. The mechanism is still being reconstructed by historians and epidemiologists, but the broad outline is clear. By the 1330s and 1340s, Yersinia pestis was moving along the Silk Road trade routes that Mongol administration had made the most secure and heavily trafficked in the history of the Eurasian commerce. The same horses at the yam stations, the same caravans moving between the same way stations, the same merchants and their goods, and the rats that travelled with those goods. All of it constituted a biological superhighway that the bacterium and its flea vectors could exploit, with an efficiency that matched the commercial efficiency the Mongols had built the system to provide. In 1346, plague was documented among Mongol forces besieging the Genoese trading colony of Kaffa, on the Crimean Peninsula, a city at the far western terminus of the Silk Road network, at the point where Central Asian trade goods were transferred onto Black Sea shipping for the final leg of the journey to the Mediterranean markets. According to the Italian chronicler Gabriele de Mussi, writing not long after the events he described, the Mongol commander Yani Beg, finding his besieging army devastated by the disease, ordered that the corpses of plague victims be catapulted over the city walls into Kaffa. The accuracy of this account is debated. Whether or not the biological warfare claim is historically reliable, the more straightforward transmission route is not. Genoese merchants fleeing Kaffa in 1347 carried infected rats and infected fleas and possibly infected people onto ships that then sailed west into the Mediterranean, docking at Sicily in October of 1347. From Sicily, the plague moved with a speed that matched the density of European commercial and maritime connections. The same efficiency of movement that had made Mediterranean trade work for centuries now worked against the populations those networks connected. Within 5 years, the Black Death had swept across virtually every inhabited portion of Europe. The death toll is still debated. Estimates range from a third to perhaps half of the continent's total population in the worst affected regions, with somewhere between 25 and 50 million people dying in Europe alone across the first wave of the epidemic, as between 1347 and 1351. In some cities, Florence, Hamburg, Bristol, the death rates in specific years approached or exceeded 60% of the population. These are numbers that remove the concept of demographic catastrophe from the realm of abstraction and place it somewhere far more visceral. The Mongol trade network had not caused the plague in any direct sense. The bacterium would have existed without the empire. But the empire had built the most efficient system for moving anything across Eurasia that had ever existed: people, goods, animals, ideas, and in doing so had built the most efficient system for moving Yersinia pestis from the rodent reservoirs of Central Asia to the port cities of the Black Sea and from there to the rest of the world. The roads that carried silk carried rats. The caravanserais that sheltered merchants sheltered fleas. The ships that moved Genoese commerce from the Black Sea to Sicily carried both. This is the deepest ambiguity of the Mongol Empire. Not the question of whether the conquests were justified. That question answers itself in the rubble of Baghdad and the bones of Ryazan. Not the question of whether the Pax Mongolica produced real benefits. It did, documented, measurable, consequential, for the long-term development of every civilization it touched. The ambiguity runs deeper than that. It is the recognition that the same thing, the empire's systematic, deliberate, unprecedented construction of Eurasian connectivity, produced both the cross-civilizational exchange that accelerated human knowledge across multiple traditions simultaneously, and the biological catastrophe that killed more people in 4 years than the Mongol conquest had killed in a century. The roads were the same roads. The caravanserais were the same caravanserais. The horses at the relay stations, the merchants with their paisa tablets, the administrators maintaining the system, all of them participated in both processes without being able to distinguish between them, because from inside the network, silk and plague look the same. They are cargo. They travel together because everything travels together when you have built a world without friction, a world where distance has been systematically compressed, and the barriers between civilizations have been systematically removed, and the movement of anything, people, goods, money, ideas, bacteria, has been made faster and cheaper and more reliable than it has ever been before. The Mongol Empire gave the world connectivity. It gave the world the Black Death, and it gave both of them for exactly the same reason. What finally destroyed the greatest land empire in human history was not an army. It was not a plague, not a rival civilization, not a weapon or a wall or a force that came from outside. What destroyed the Mongol Empire was the Mongol Empire itself, the structural contradiction buried inside its founding logic, a contradiction that Genghis Khan had spent his lifetime building and that his descendants spent a century detonating in slow motion. Here is the problem. Genghis Khan conquered the world through absolute personal authority, through a loyalty system that bound his commanders to him specifically, and through a legal code, the yasa, that governed everything from the treatment of merchants to the punishment of traitors. But the yasa said almost nothing useful about what happened when the Khan died. The tradition of the Kurultai, the great assembly of Mongol nobles and military commanders that had proclaimed Genghis Khan universal ruler in 1206, was supposed to resolve succession. In practice, it created a mechanism for legitimizing whoever had already assembled enough military support to dominate the assembly. The process was not election in any meaningful sense. It was the formalization of a power struggle that had already been decided by force or intimidation or strategic alliance. Every time a great Khan died, the empire held its breath and waited to find out whether the next Kurultai would produce a new ruler quickly enough to prevent the factions from hardening into permanent division. For a generation it worked, barely. Ogedai's election in 1229 was contentious but conclusive. His death in 1241 triggered the withdrawal from Europe and opened a succession crisis that took years to resolve. Gyuk reigned for less than 2 years before dying in 1248 under circumstances that contemporaries found suspicious. Munka's election in 1251 required what amounted to a purge of the Ogedai faction. Executions and forced relocations of rivals that stripped entire branches of the Chinggisid family of their influence. When Munka died during the campaign against the Song dynasty in 1259, there was no clean succession. There were 2 brothers who both wanted the throne, and the armies that supported them did not wait for a Kurultai to resolve the question. Kublai and Arikaböke fought a civil war for the title of Great Khan between 1260 and 1264. Kublai won. But winning cost him something that no military victory could fully restore. It cost him the principle of unified Mongol sovereignty. By the time Kublai consolidated control, the empire was already operating as 4 functionally independent entities that shared a family lineage and a founding mythology, but were increasingly diverging in interest, policy, religion, and territorial ambition. The Golden Horde controlled the Russian steppe and the trade routes north of the Caspian and Black Seas, governing from Sarai on the Volga River, and maintaining a relationship with the Russian principalities that was simultaneously exploitative and, in its own way, administratively stable. The Golden Horde extracted tribute, provided a kind of brutal order, and in doing so shaped the political culture of Russia in ways that historians still debate but cannot dismiss. The Ilkhanate ruled Persia and much of the Middle East from its capital at Tabriz, increasingly Persianized in its administration and court culture, converting to Islam under Ghazan Khan in 1295 in a political and religious transformation that would have been unthinkable to the Mongol commanders who had destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate 40 years earlier. The Chagatai Khanate held Central Asia, the heartland of the original Silk Road, of the territory that connected everything else, and was ruled by a line that remained most closely attached to nomadic Mongol tradition, resisting the sedentary administrative models that Kublai Khan had embraced in China, and that the Ilkhans were adopting in Persia. And then there was the Yuan dynasty, the wealthiest and most administratively sophisticated of the 4, governing China's 60 million people from Khanbaliq with a bureaucracy that was more Chinese than Mongol, in everything except the family name of the man at its top. These 4 entities did not coexist peacefully. The Ilkhanate and the Golden Horde went to war repeatedly over control of the Caucasus region. The Chagatai Khanate and the Yuan dynasty skirmished along their shared borders. The theological transformation of the Ilkhanate, from the pragmatic religious pluralism of the early Mongol period to formal Sunni Islam under Ghazan, created fault lines with the Buddhist-inclined Yuan court. The Pax Mongolica, that century of enforced Eurasian stability, was maintained not because the Khanates were cooperating, but in spite of the fact that they were periodically fighting each other, because the trade routes that generated the revenue they all depended on required a minimum of stability that even hostile Khanates had an interest in preserving. When that minimum began to erode in the mid-14th century, when the Black Death was moving through the same trade networks, when political instability in multiple khanates simultaneously was disrupting the relay stations and the caravanserais and the administered roads, the infrastructure of the Pax Mongolica began to dissolve, and with it the revenue flows that had made governing such vast territories economically viable. In China, the dissolution took a specific form. The Yuan dynasty had never fully resolved the tension between its Mongol identity and its Chinese institutional framework. Kublai Khan had been a sophisticated administrator who genuinely engaged with Chinese governance traditions, but his successors were less capable or less interested. The emperors who followed Kublai's death in 1294 came and went with alarming speed. 9 emperors in the first half of the 14th century, and several of them ruling for only a few years before dying or being deposed, the court factional struggles becoming increasingly detached from the actual business of governing a country of 60 million people, experiencing floods, famines, and epidemic disease simultaneously. The Yellow River flooded catastrophically in the 1340s, destroying crops across the North China Plain and displacing enormous populations. The Grand Canal, the infrastructure project that moved grain from the productive south to the capital in the north, fell into disrepair. Famine spread. The legitimacy of Yuan rule, always somewhat conditional among a Chinese population governed by foreign rulers who maintained a formal ethnic hierarchy that placed Mongols at the top, evaporated. The rebellions that ended Yuan rule began in the 1350s. They were not a single coordinated uprising, but a proliferation of regional movements, each with its own leadership, its own ideology, its own mix of religious millenarianism and practical grievance. The Red Turban movement, inspired by a mix of Buddhist millennialism and ethnic Chinese resentment of Mongol rule, was the largest and most consequential. Its commanders fought each other as often as they fought the Yuan, but the net effect was the progressive loss of Yuan control over the Chinese countryside. One of those commanders, a man named Zhu Yuanzhang, born a peasant, orphaned by plague and famine, who had begged for food as a child and entered a Buddhist monastery out of desperation before finding in warfare a talent that no monastery could have predicted, proved to be the decisive figure. He consolidated the rebel factions under his authority through a combination of military effectiveness and political acuity, and in 1368 he declared the Ming dynasty and marched on Kanbalik. The last Yuan emperor, Tohon Temur, fled north across the Gobi Desert with the remnants of his court and his army, retreating back to the steppe from which his ancestors had come. China was free. The Yuan dynasty was over. 162 years after Genghis Khan had been proclaimed universal ruler on the banks of the Onon River, the empire he had built had lost its richest and most populous possession to a man whose father had died of plague in a province that Mongol conquest had helped depopulate a century earlier. The other Khanates outlasted the Yuan by varying degrees but followed the same fundamental trajectory: internal fragmentation, succession disputes, the progressive erosion of the administrative systems that had made Mongol rule functional, the reassertion of local identities and local power. The Golden Horde splintered into competing successor states across the 15th century, its territory eventually absorbed into the expanding Russian state, a state whose own political culture had been shaped, scholars argue, in complicated ways by 2 centuries of Mongol overlordship. The Ilkhanate effectively dissolved in the 1330s, fragmenting into regional dynasties. The Chagatai Khanate persisted longest in name, but by the late 14th century it was a shadow of its former extent, its territory contested by the Timurid successor empire that emerged from within what had been Mongol Central Asia, the empire that had controlled 23 million square kilometers at its height, that had administered a quarter of the world's population, that had built the most comprehensive communications infrastructure the pre-modern world had ever seen. That empire simply ceased to exist as a unified entity. It did not end with a battle or a treaty or a surrender. It dissolved, slowly and unevenly, from the inside out, consumed by the same dynamics of personal ambition and succession fragility that had characterized Mongol political culture from the beginning. but the dissolution of an empire is not the erasure of its consequences, and the Mongol Empire's consequences are still being measured, with satellite imaging, such as with population genetics, with climate modelling, with epidemiological modelling, in ways that would have been incomprehensible to anyone who lived through the conquest themselves. Consider what scientists found in 2003. A team of geneticists led by Chris Tyler Smith and Tatiana Zerjal published a study in the American Journal of Human Genetics analysing the Y chromosome diversity of populations across a swath of territory spanning from Central Asia to the Pacific. What they found was a specific Y chromosome lineage, a cluster of closely related genetic profiles on the male line chromosome that appeared with extraordinary frequency across a geographic range that corresponded with remarkable precision to the territory that had once been under Mongol control or direct Mongol influence. The lineage appeared in populations from the Caspian Sea to China, in frequencies that range from a few percent to more than 60% in some specific Central Asian populations. When the researchers calculated how many living men worldwide might carry this lineage, they arrived at a figure of approximately 16 million, roughly 0.5% of the entire male population of the Earth at the time of the study. The researchers proposed that this lineage traces to Genghis Khan himself, or to a close male line relative. The logic was straightforward in outline. Genghis Khan had multiple wives and concubines, fathered an unknown number of children, and his male line descendants, who numbered in the hundreds by the time of the empire's fragmentation, would have had similar reproductive access to women across the territories they controlled. A founder effect of this scale, concentrated across such a specific geographic range, pointed to a single individual or lineage of extraordinary reproductive advantage operating at precisely the period when the Mongol Empire existed. The methodology, however, is vigorously contested. The 2003 study did not prove that the lineage belongs to Genghis Khan. It cannot, because there is no confirmed biological sample from Genghis Khan to compare against. The assignment of the lineage to the Khan specifically requires a chain of inference that some geneticists find compelling and others find overreaching. Other powerful founders could theoretically account for the lineage. The geographic correlation with Mongol territory is suggestive, not definitive, and the study's sampling methodology, drawing on populations that were accessible and willing to participate rather than a systematically representative sample of the region's genetic diversity, introduces biases that its authors acknowledged and critics have since amplified. The 16 million figure circulates widely in popular accounts of the Mongols, usually without the methodological caveats. The scientific picture is more ambiguous than the headline suggests. What remains true is this: something happened to the population genetics of Central and East Asia during the Mongol period that left a detectable signal in the Y chromosomes of living men 8 centuries later. Well, what exactly that something was, whose genes it actually reflects, and how confidently we can assign it to any specific individual, those questions remain genuinely open. The climate study is even more contested, and in some ways even more extraordinary. In 2011, a team led by Julia Pongratz at the Carnegie Institution for Science published research in the journal The Holocene, arguing that the Mongol conquests had a measurable impact on Earth's carbon cycle. The mechanism proposed was demographic. The conquests depopulated enormous territories, particularly in northern China, Central Asia and Persia, and in the decades after the conquest, agricultural land that had been farmed for generations was abandoned. Abandoned farmland reverts to forest and grassland. Forests absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The researchers estimated that the reforestation following Mongol-related depopulation absorbed approximately 700 million metric tons of carbon over the relevant period, enough, they argued, to contribute to a slight cooling of global temperatures detectable in the climate record. The paper generated enormous attention and equally enormous pushback. The core objections are multiple and substantial. The death toll estimates that underlie the calculation are themselves deeply uncertain. The range of scholarly estimates for Mongol-related deaths runs from 10 million to 40 million or more, and the difference between those figures is not a rounding error. It is the difference between a demographic catastrophe of one scale and an entirely different scale, with proportionally different effects on land use and carbon sequestration. The relationship between depopulation, land abandonment, and reforestation is not as straightforward as the model assumes. Recovery of agricultural land after conquest could be rapid or slow, depending on political and ecological conditions that varied enormously across the territories in question. And the relationship between regional, reforestation, and global carbon levels involves atmospheric dynamics complex enough that the attribution of a specific temperature signal to a specific historical event requires assumptions that climate scientists have disputed. Some researchers find the methodology plausible as a broad strokes exercise. Others consider it an extrapolation too far from available evidence. What the study does, regardless of its technical merits, is force a specific and uncomfortable question into the open. If the deaths caused by the Mongol conquest were so numerous and so geographically concentrated that they altered the planet's carbon balance, what does that tell us about the scale of what happened between 1206 and the end of the conquest period? And if the answer to that question is we genuinely don't know precisely, what does that uncertainty tell us about the limits of historical knowledge itself? And then there is the tomb, the single most concrete, most tantalizing, most definitively unresolved mystery that the Mongol Empire left behind. When Genghis Khan died in August of 1227, during the siege of Yinchuan, his body carried in secret back across the Gobi Desert to the Mongol homeland. The people who oversaw his burial appear to have gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that no one would ever find it. The sources describe a procession that killed every person encountered along the route to eliminate witnesses. They describe a burial site that was deliberately disguised. The earth was stamped flat, trees were planted, a river was potentially diverted to flow across the grave. The secret history of the Mongols, the closest thing to an official Mongol account of their own early history, is frustratingly vague on the specifics. Later Persian and Chinese sources add details that contradict each other. The burial site was described as being on a mountain called Burkhan Khaldun in the Khenti region of northeastern Mongolia, a mountain sacred to the Mongols long before Genghis Khan's birth. The mountain is real. The grave has not been found. This is not for lack of trying. In the modern era, the search for Genghis Khan's tomb has become one of archaeology's persistent obsessions. American archaeologists used satellite imaging in the early 2000s to survey the Khenti region, analysing changes in vegetation patterns and ground disturbance visible from orbit that might indicate a large ancient burial. Japanese researchers conducted ground surveys in the 1990s using non-invasive geophysical techniques. In 2012, a project called Valley of the Khans, partly crowdsourced, using satellite imagery analysed by volunteers identifying anomalies, focused on the same region and identified numerous potential sites for ground investigation. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have been conducted at multiple locations. None of it has produced a confirmed burial site. Some archaeologists believe the tomb may be underwater, that the river diversion mentioned in certain sources is real, and the grave now lies beneath a riverbed. Others believe the landscape has changed so dramatically over 8 centuries that the surface features described in the sources no longer correspond to anything visible. Others point to the sheer vastness of the Khenti region and the deliberate nature of the concealment and suggest bluntly that a site designed by determined people who controlled the area and killed the witnesses was designed to stay hidden. The Mongolian government has complicated matters further. The Khenti region, including Burkhan Khaldun, is part of the Khan Khenti strictly protected area, a conservation zone where certain types of archaeological investigation are restricted. There is also a deeply felt Mongolian cultural sentiment, not universally shared but widely expressed, that the grave should remain undisturbed, that finding and opening it would constitute a desecration of something that has been protected by its own invisibility for nearly 800 years. The man who was born in obscurity on the Mongolian steppe, who was left for dead as a child, who escaped captivity with a wooden board around his neck and built from those humiliations a state that swallowed civilizations. That man lies somewhere in the earth of his homeland, in a place that every instrument of modern technology has yet to identify. It is as though the erasure he arranged for himself was so thorough, so deliberately conceived and so successfully executed, that even the tools he could never have imagined, the satellites, the radar, the spectral analysis of soil chemistry from orbit, cannot undo what was done with shovels and secrecy in the autumn of 1227. Which brings us finally to the question, the one that runs underneath everything else in this story, that surfaces in every serious scholarly work on the Mongol Empire, and that refuses to resolve itself into a clean answer, no matter how much evidence accumulates on either side. Was the Mongol Empire the most destructive force in human history? Or was it the first great engine of the globalized world, the entity that, more than any other single force, created the conditions for the accelerated exchange of knowledge and goods and people, that ultimately drove the early modern period and set the stage for everything that came after? Historians have been arguing about this for 2 centuries, and the current state of the argument is not convergence. It is productive, uncomfortable, unresolved tension between 2 interpretive frameworks that are each supported by real evidence and that cannot be reconciled without making a philosophical choice about what history is ultimately for and what it is ultimately about. The case for the destruction is not ambiguous. Roughly 20 to 40 million people died during the Mongol conquests. The range is wide, the uncertainty genuine, but even the lower end of that range represents a catastrophe without parallel in the pre-modern world. The cities destroyed were not abstract statistics. Samarkand, Bukhara, Nishapur, Merv, Urgench, Kiev, Baghdad. Each of these was a living human community, in some cases one of the most sophisticated urban environments on Earth, with populations, economies, intellectual traditions, artistic cultures, and physical infrastructures that took generations to build and that the Mongol armies destroyed in days. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad did not rebuild. The agricultural infrastructure of the Iranian plateau, the ancient Khanate irrigation systems that had sustained Persian civilization for 2,000 years, was damaged so severely by the Mongol invasions that some regions did not recover their pre-conquest population levels for centuries. The human cost of what the Mongol armies did is not a debating point. It is a reality recorded in the archaeology of abandoned cities and the demographic evidence of depopulated regions. And yet, the Pax Mongolica was real. The Silk Road revival was real. Marco Polo's journey was real. The transmission of paper-making and printing and gunpowder to the West was real. The movement of Islamic mathematics and Persian astronomy to China was real. The administrative innovations of the Yuan dynasty were real and influential in ways that echoed into Chinese governance long after the Mongols had been expelled. The postal relay system that carried messages across 8,000 miles of Eurasia in 2 weeks was real, and nothing comparable would exist again until the telegraph. The cross-civilizational intellectual exchange that took place at Mungke Khan's court, at Kublai Khan's court, is in the libraries and workshops of Ilkhani Persia, was real, and its products fed into the Renaissance, into the Islamic Golden Age's later chapters, into the scientific and commercial transformations of the early modern period. Both things are true. The destruction and the connectivity are not separate stories happening to different people in different places. They are the same story happening to the same world. The same army that burned Baghdad built the road that carried Chinese printing technology to the West. The same administrative system that extracted tribute from subjugated Russia maintained the trade infrastructure that allowed goods and ideas to flow between civilizations that had never been in direct contact before. The same routes that carried silk carried plague. The same empire that killed tens of millions of people also created, for a century, something that looks remarkably like a prototype for the kind of integrated, interconnected, mutually dependent world that we live in now. A world where distance has been compressed, where the movement of goods and information across vast geographic distances is routine, where the encounter between different civilizations is constant rather than exceptional. The Mongol Empire did not give us that world directly. Too much changed in the centuries between the fall of the Yuan dynasty and the present for any direct causal line to be convincing. But it demonstrated that such a world was possible. It demonstrated that a connected Eurasian civilization, chaotic, violent, unequal, shot through with brutality and exploitation and the specific cruelties of imperial power, was nonetheless capable of producing something qualitatively new in the history of human organization. Something that, once experienced, could not be entirely forgotten, even after the empire that produced it had fragmented and dissolved and retreated into the steppe. The man who started it all lies somewhere in the earth of Mongolia, in a location that 8 centuries of searching have failed to reveal. His genetic signal, if the 2003 study is correct, if the attribution holds, if the methodology survives the scrutiny it has not fully survived, echoes in the chromosomes of 16 million living men who will never know they carry it. His conquests may have altered the global carbon cycle, though the evidence is debated. His empire reshaped the political geography of Asia and Eastern Europe in ways that are still legible in the map of the modern world. The borders of states, the distribution of religious traditions, the demographic composition of entire regions, all of it bears some mark of what began on the Onon River in 1206, when a man who had been left to die on the steppe as a child told an assembled gathering of Mongol warriors that heaven had appointed him to rule all nations. He was wrong about one thing: he did not rule all nations. The empire stopped at the Egyptian Mamluks. It stopped at the Japanese coastlines twice, in storms. It stopped at the forests and swamps of Southeast Asia, where steppe cavalry had no advantage. It stopped, ultimately, at the structural limits of what any political entity built on personal loyalty and family succession could sustain across millions of square miles and multiple generations. But what it accomplished before it stopped, the sheer geographic and human scale of it, the speed, the sophistication, the violence, the connectivity, the irreversible alteration of civilizations from China to Hungary, that remains one of the most extraordinary things that has ever happened in the history of human beings organizing themselves to act collectively upon the world. The empire swallowed itself. The Khan remains unfound. The consequences remain unmeasured. And the question of what it all ultimately meant, whether the destruction and the connectivity were two expressions of the same force, or two fundamentally different things that happened to share the same roads, that question does not have an answer that will satisfy everyone who asks it. It has instead something rarer and more honest. It has weight. The kind of weight that tells you, when you feel it, that you're standing close to something real,